Hello guys, this is your friend Naruto Audio Fanfics and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is, what if Naruto was bound by a forgotten promise, and Hinata, Ino, Karin, Yugito, Tamari, Tenten, and Tayuya became his fate, part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Hyuga Hiashi rounded the corner at a dead run, dodging branches and rocks alike as he prayed he wasn't too late. As he came around into the opening to the ravine he skidded to a halt and gasped at the sight in front of him. His eyes hardened as he saw his closest friend, Namikaze Minato lying half in, half out of a protective circle. Blood was everywhere, but the nine-tailed fox was nowhere to be seen. Hiashi ran over and knelt at his friend's side then almost fell back in shock as Minato's good eye opened and slowly focused on him. Hiashi was always impressed with his ability to shrug off damage, but this rivaled anything that he had seen or heard of at any time before. Hiashi, my friend, time is short, do you remember Fire Ridge? He nodded as he rested a hand on Minato's shoulder, his Byakugan in the deepest level studying the extensive damage. Minato's body wasn't so much broken, as it was disrupted. As he watched muscles unraveled, tendons burst sections at a time, organs failed and began collapsing into gelatin bit by bit. There was nothing even the most powerful medic Nin could do to save him. Minato reached down and pulled a pouch from his waist and handed it to Hiashi. Hiashi accepted it but would not look at it. Please Minato, save your strength. We need to wait until help arrives. Minato grinned at him but shook his head. There was no need to say anything, but he looked at the pouch again. As Hiashi opened it and shook it, a piece of pumice dropped out into his hand. Hiashi blinked then looked at Minato. Hiashi, you uptight, you never were a good liar. Plural. Please listen, do not speak. Hiashi nodded as he moved closer to hear his friend. The Kyuubi, I couldn't beat it. Too powerful, its power is eternal, cannot be destroyed. I sealed it. It is inside, Naruto. My notes on the seal are in my house. Please, protect him. Teach him, as if he were your own. But first, you must find him. Jeriah took him after the seal was complete. Keep the PR. Promise you have made. Fire Ridge, swear it. Hiashi was horrified at first. He sealed the demon in his own son. I did not think he was serious when he told the council he would if he couldn't beat it. Hiashi blinked as a tear escaped his eye. Stupid clown ninja. I swear to you, I will find him, and I will honor the promise I have made to you. On my life, the life of my family and clan, Naruto will be as my son. Minato nodded slowly then reached up and touched Hiashi's forehead, causing his eyes to glow momentarily and Hiashi shook his head as a wave of dizziness overcame him. He looked down at Minato who smiled again. The gift will be passed by the proud heart, to the pure heart. The pure heart unlocks the gate, and will become black, but be cleansed by the power of hate. The beast will claim two, but the beast will be split by the power of one, black as night, bright as day. Do not forget this, my friend. As Minato breathed his last Hiashi deactivated his Byakugan and gritted his teeth. He picked up his friend's broken body and carried it to the entrance of the canyon as Hisashi came running in with others of the Hyuga house guard. Unashamed, Hiashi looked at his brother with the tears coursing down his face. The two brothers looked at each other and Hisashi nodded as Hiashi continued to the Leaf Village gates. Uzumaki Naruto is still missing. Leave no stone unturned. Find the Hokage's son. Oh. Jeriah stood impatiently until an older woman stepped out from behind the closed door. She walked over and smiled at the cooing baby. The child seemed completely oblivious to his surroundings, and despite not being with his mother or father, he didn't cry or otherwise fuss in any way. The matron looked at Jeriah and smiled again. What a strong little boy, and he looks so much like his father. What is his name? The toad Sanin nodded as he looked at the baby and rubbed his arm lightly with a fingertip. Naruto. Jeriah sighed somewhat sadly. There are special circumstances to his existence. He is to be well cared for, and treated as if his parents were still alive. You will take very good care of him, do you understand me? The older woman nodded. I will care for him as I cared for my own before they grew and moved on. She looked at him and frowned slightly. Does anyone else know? The man sighed as he nodded. Too many. I fear what will happen if they discover where he is. I will begin a rumor. This way, if anyone finds him with ill intent, they will leave him alone, but it will be up to you to protect him. Do you think it will be that bad? The council promised to protect him. To honor the Hokage's wishes. Jeriah wished that would be the case, but he knew better. Minato had enemies on the council, and killing Naruto would be the best way for a coward to get back at a man they could never beat. And unfortunately, there are quite a few cowards in the Leaf Village. The older woman nodded as Naruto began to cry. She picked him up and they heard his stomach gurgle and she laughed lightly. Already showing signs that you are your mother's son. Casually she unbuttoned her blouse and maneuvered the baby until he latched onto her and began to feed. She winced in partial pain. It has been a while since I had to feed a baby, but thankfully my milk never dried up. Hiring myself out as a wet nurse for so many years has paid off finally. Jeriah watched for a moment then turned away with a slight blush. Ah, yes, well I must go, but if you need me I will be back in a few months, as quick as I can to check on him and you. Placing a pouch on the table by the door he turned to her again. The sum in that pouch should be sufficient to support the two of you for quite some time. The woman nodded and began to hum as she rocked Naruto back and forth in her arms. I will take good care of him, Jeriah, do not worry. Jeriah smiled. Thank you, Alana. I will see the two of you soon. Unfortunately, the Toad Sage knew nothing of Hiashi's promise to Minato. If he had, he would have let the man take the boy because he would have been treated well, and no one would dare go against the head of one of the most powerful clans in Konoha. Sadly, Jeriah did all he could, but it was woefully insufficient. He came to see them the end of the first year, and Naruto had grown and was surprisingly already walking. He looked at Jeriah and watched him, but never said a word. The Toad Sage took it in stride. He was after all a stranger to the child, but while he was around the boy didn't even babble as most children that age do once they begin crawling or walking. He would smile at Alana, and watch Jeriah, but the strangest would be the way he would sometimes look off into space and nod to himself. Hopefully he isn't retarded. Still, his development was good, and the boy seemed strong as an ox, with double the appetite. Leaving another substantial sum, Jeriah left again. As fate would have it, this was the time period where great and sad things were taking place in the elemental lands. He was gone longer than he wanted to be. Originally he planned to be gone every 3 months. Another year passed before he returned, and discovered the worst possible thing could have happened. Naruto was gone. He found the remains of Alana at the bottom of the ravine down from her house. Foul play seemed unlikely, the bones were unbroken, and there was no telling really how long her body had been here. He gave her a proper burial in her garden and marked a stone and placed it at the top of her grave. But that left one very obvious question and even worse dilemma. Where was Naruto? Oh. Hiashi grumbled as he read another report, another failure. It had been 3 years since the Toad Sannin stole the child of his friend, Nay. He had to stop lying to himself, it didn't make it hurt less. Minato was as much his brother as Hisashi was. He twiddled the pumice paperweight on his desk with his index finger. Fire Ridge, it seemed so long ago. Then, Hiashi was a proud man, not taken to getting help from anyone. Back then, the thought disgusted him, and he would not lower himself to ask for help from anyone. The battle had gone badly for the Leaf Shinobi. Many had died. There were too few left to even be able to call it a fighting force. Hiashi had found himself in a trench sitting across from the Namikaze, the one that aspired to be Hokage. He didn't like him, but he respected him. The man was an incredible fighter. Hiashi had never seen anyone shrug off the amounts of pain and damage that he did. He had seen Namikaze take 2 arrows in the stomach, and one dangerously close to his heart, and still he shoved a Rasengan into the enemy's midst, killing the majority of them so that the puny remainder of Hiashi's clansmen could finish off the rest. They were sure he would die, but after the second night and he still lived they realized there was something incredible about him. Hiashi's respect soon turned to admiration and he began to talk to him. He found out much and eventually a friendship formed between the two. Then it happened. The two of them agreed to attack the enemy's flank to buy the remainder of their men time to withdraw. Hiashi and Minato struck terror wherever they went, fighting a 2-man guerrilla battle. What was worse, this was not their territory, and they knew it better than the enemies they fought. Inevitably, luck has to run out. Hiashi was struck by a flaming rock that broke his left shoulder, and then another that broke his right thigh in 2 places. Hiashi-sama, can you walk? Minato looked at his friend and he shook his head as he surveyed the damage with his Byakugan. No, it is broken, the bones will grind or become a compound fracture if I try to walk. I guess it is time we parted company, my clown ninja. Please tell Izumi I am sorry I will not be able to marry her as I promised. The insult rolled easily from his mouth, but Minato smiled. You uptight. I would, but I hate giving my friends bad news. Hiashi blinked but then gritted his teeth in pain as Minato picked him up and slung him over his shoulder, fighting and deflecting arrows, rocks, and spears as they flew at them. Hiashi bounced around on his shoulder until the pain finally took away his consciousness. When he awoke, they were in the hands of a group of medic nin, and a relief force sent by the third Hokage. The battle was over. Seeing the relief force, composed of all of the hidden villages, the invading force backed down and returned to where they had come from. Hiashi was still unsure where they had come from, or even who they were. In the history texts, it was referred to as the Secret War. As quickly as it came, it disappeared, but it had definitely left its mark. Many fine nin died those days, including Hiashi's father. Minato again surprised everyone. He staggered into the camp, bleeding from multiple deep gashes, projectiles once again protruding from his body. When he awoke, he had survived the night after the nin said there was no way he could. In the coming days, Minato was on his feet again as Hiashi was on the mend. By the end of the week, Hiashi was walking again, and Minato was none the worse for wear. Hiashi could not forget what he had done for him. As they walked, he reached down and picked up a plain piece of pumice and carved his initials in one side and Minato's in the other, then handed it to him. I know this is only a piece of rock in appearance, but it is also my promise to you, that I will honor any request you make of me. You have saved my life, and ensured a future for my love Izumi, and for that I can never repay you, but I promise you, anything you request, I will gladly grant, to one who is like a brother to me. Minato blinked back a tear and smiled at Hiashi. Thank you, Hiashi-sama. Words such as these, spoken by men such as these, was a serious thing. They both knew the other was serious, and that this was a bond that would not be willingly broken by either. A few months later, Minato staggered onto the Hyuga estates and walked into the dojo where Hiashi was practicing. Seeing his friend, he walked over, but before he could speak, he asked a question that surprised Hiashi. Do you remember Fire Ridge? Hiashi nodded, then Minato continued. The request Minato made shocked Hiashi and he grinned at first, but seeing the serious expression on his face made him stop, then nod his head in affirmation. Only my brother could make such a request and I would grant it. It is still early, and though it goes against my better judgment, I will do this. A few days passed and Minato brought a document to Hiashi, which they both read, then both signed, and it was never spoken of again. The bargain had been struck. Many months would pass between the two, sparring, laughing, and joking. He the head of the Hyuga clan, and eventually Minato the Hokage of the Hidden Leaf village. Yes, Minato had made a request a few years before, and Hiashi at first did not take it seriously, so thought nothing of it. But when he handed him the stone and asked him to remember Fire Ridge, the request came back. And Hiashi never, ever went back on his word. His wife brought him a fresh cup of tea and he smiled at her. Hiashi-kun, we will find him. The look in her eyes undershot the strength in her voice. Hiashi, lost in his thoughts, did not notice and only nodded as he patted his wife's hand that rested on his shoulder. Where are you, Naruto? It's been 2 years, where are you? Oh. The boy wandered the streets, dirty, clothes barely hanging from his gangly frame and torn in places. He didn't speak as he wandered, but people looked and avoided him. He didn't notice, because he seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, whatever they were. As he rounded a corner, he felt a hand grab him and pull him into an alley. He saw stars as he was flung into a wall further into the gloom, and he thought he saw 3 men standing over him in a semicircle, boxing him in so he couldn't run. I told you it was him. He's dirty and he stinks, but that's the Jinchuriki. Naruto blinked as he looked up at the men but didn't understand what happened. Did the men throw him here? Why? Had he been bad? He was bad once and the woman who took care of him spanked him. It hurt but it got better. But he didn't like it and he didn't want these men to spank him. Their hands were bigger. Naruto covered his butt with his hands and backed against a wall. The men didn't even notice this response, so busy they were contemplating what they would do. Two of the men pulled out knives but the man who recognized what Naruto was stopped them. No, we can't kill him. The Sannin told me and a friend that if he dies before his 16th birthday, the Kyuubi no Kitsune will be released again. The two looked at him and frowned. I think I heard that too, or something like it. The third nodded and got a sick smile on his face. Oh, we won't kill him then, we'll just make him a little prettier. One man came closer as Naruto backed into the furthest part of the alley away from the entrance. Fear gripped him as he whined and pushed himself into the corner and the man came within striking distance. Suddenly he lashed out and the blade cut a line across Naruto's right chest, sending fiery pain through the damaged skin. Naruto cried out and fell to the ground, seemingly wrapping himself around the pain, tears running down his face as the other two closed in as well. Alright, now we get some revenge. Naruto's eyes looked up at them and he screamed one word as his chin quivered and the tears ran freely down his face. MOMMMMMMAAAAAA. Oh. A lone Hyuga messenger walked down the street running errands for the main house. He had delivered a message to the tailor for Lady Hyuga, and he had already dropped off the letter at the postmaster's office. All he had to do was pick up the groceries, then he would be able to relax with his girlfriend for a while. A child's cry caught his attention and he turned to see what direction it came from. He could tell immediately that it was a scream of terror, even though it didn't sound like words. After turning in a complete circle he stopped and wondered if he even heard anything at all, until he heard the screaming. Orienting on the screams he ran towards a set of buildings. He didn't know what he would do, but like the leader of the clan he abhorred the idea of anyone inflicting adult pain on a child. Before he reached the mouth of the alley, the screams suddenly stopped. As he rounded the corner a feeling of dread gripped his spine, but two guardsmen ran up and stopped him. Stay back, sir. Let us handle this. He frowned but nodded as one of the guardsmen entered the alley, but a few seconds later a loud gasp and the unmistakable sounds of someone reliving a meal the hard way could be heard. As the other guardsman and the Hyuga messenger entered the alley they were greeted with a horrific sight. All three men were unrecognizable. Body parts littered the entire back area, and blood covered almost the entire area of the 10-foot wide alley. The more inexperienced guardsman knelt on the alley floor retching loudly. Naruto was nowhere to be seen. So the question still remained. Where was Naruto? What does this all mean, I wonder? Hiashi threw an open palm chakra strike towards Hiashi's chest, but he spun off and threw one of his own as Hiashi spun away from it. They had been sparring in this manner for hours now. Hiashi knew what was bothering his brother, but there was no way to console him except by sparring. So being the good brother that he was, he left his son Neji with his wife this morning and prepared to be exhausted and sore again. It didn't seem to matter how good he was, Hiashi always left him sore and tired. He chuckled inwardly as he did a split, groin strike, only to have Hiashi flip over him and he barely rolled away from the chakra strike aimed at his skull. He seems more intense today, much more focused than usual. I wonder what has occurred. As he came to his feet he tucked and rolled forward once, twice, 3 times to avoid each subsequent leg strike that his brother threw at him until he changed his stance and the 4th foot strike, which would have clipped his shoulder, pushed him off of the chakra pivot he created and spun him towards Hiashi with his right elbow leading. He shouldn't have gotten excited as Hiashi caught the elbow, reversing his spin again and catching him in the back with a mantis thrust to the center point between his shoulder blades, numbing that area as the chakra point was closed, but as he flew forward his mule strike caught his brother in the chest on either side of his sternum, flinging him back into the floor. As they both climbed slowly to their feet Hiashi smiled and his brother returned it as he rotated his shoulder backwards to return some of the feeling. You are doing much better today, Hiashi. Usually you would not have been able to hit me this early in our sparring. Hiashi grinned then bowed slightly to the clan head. Thank you, brother, but I think it is due more to your distracted state of mind than any skill of mine. Shall we continue? Hiashi scowled as he looked down at the footprints on his tunic before shaking his head slightly. No, to be honest, you are correct. My head is not really into it today. He walked over to the bench and picked up a towel and dried off the small amount of perspiration that had gathered on his brow and the nape of his neck, but clenched his hand into a fist at his side for a moment before tossing the towel into the basket next to the table. Hiashi, noticing his brother's uncharacteristic anger, rested a hand on his shoulder and squeezed lightly. Tell me what troubles you, brother. Hiashi glanced askance at Hiashi, then nodded as he turned and sat on the floor Indian style. I received startling news yesterday. I cannot be sure about the accuracy of the report until I have the official report from the watch officers that discovered the scene, but the remains of 3 men were found in an alley roughly 4 blocks from the Hyuga estates. Hiashi frowned as he considered the words, then shrugged slightly. It is disturbing that someone would commit a grisly murder so close to our property, but I see no reason to worry over much about it, brother. At Hiyashi's smile, Hiashi blinked. What? There is more. What aren't you telling me, Hiashi-sama? Hiashi grinned and licked his lips slightly before he continued. It is not so much the murders, it was the manner, and the damage the bodies sustained. Hiyashi's eyes seemed to glaze slightly as he recounted the conversation. Flashback. Izumi poured another cup of tea for her husband as he pored over another stack of reports that showed nothing useful of Naruto's location or condition. With a snort of disgust, he swept the third-time read stack into a waste basket and grumbled to himself. Izumi carefully placed the teapot on the stand next to the desk, then rubbed her husband's shoulders until he groaned in pleasure. If not for you and Hinata, Izumi, I think I would have gone mad months ago. She smiled in pleasure at his compliment, then leaned forward and kissed his ear, but continued to rub his neck and shoulders until a knock occurred at the door. Izumi looked into her husband's face and he nodded slightly. Enter, she said, and he reached up and gently patted her hand as an unfamiliar courier walked in and shut the door behind him. Forgive me, Lord Hyuga, but I have news that may be of interest to you. I was unsure of its import myself, but if the guardsman I talked to is correct. Hiashi gestured for the man to calm himself with a hand as Izumi poured him also a cup of tea. He accepted it with a quiet, thank you, then sipped lightly at it until he was able to regain high composure. Hiashi smiled at the man, then nodded as he picked up his own teacup. Now, continue. My lord, I was running errands for the household when I heard what I thought was a child's scream. I rushed to where I thought I heard it, but I and 2 guardsmen only found 3 madly mutilated bodies. It was close to the compound, so this concerned me, but what one of the guardsmen told me made me rush back here. Hiashi tried to keep his patience, so he breathed deeply, then let it out slowly. Please, tell me what has you so concerned. The man nodded as he gulped the rest of the tea down, then set the cup back upon the table with slightly trembling fingers. The guard told me he had only seen this kind of damage once before, at the hands of Uzumaki Kushina. Hiashi stopped in mid-sip and spilled tea down his chin and onto his robes as he missed his mouth and blinked at the man before surging to his feet with a shout. What? You sit here sipping tea and playing the simpleton while my charge could be suffering. Take me to the location. The man stuttered, then fell over before jumping to his feet and bowing. Yes, my lord. Turning, he flung open the door to Hiyashi's study, then bolted out with Hiashi hot on his heels. Izumi looked startled and lost as she watched her husband's back retreat through the house until he turned a corner and was gone. She slowly walked over and knelt in behind his desk and cleaned up the spilt tea and placed the cup on the serving table next to his desk with a slightly trembling hand. Had they finally found Naruto? Inside her heart she was happy for her husband if they did finally find him, but in the deepest recesses of her mind fear gripped her as she worried over what finding him would mean. Present. Hiashi breathed quietly as he thought hard for a few seconds, then smiled at his brother. There was not much left of the murder scene, except scraps of flesh, and blood of course. But the report I should be getting from the guardsmen should confirm or deny what the courier told me. Hiashi blinked as he thought about it, then nodded. But Kushina is dead, killed by the Kyuubi before Minato. So you believe his mother's Kake Genkai has manifested in him already? If that is true, how is that possible? Hiashi shrugged as he thought about it, before he rested his palms on his thighs. I do not know. It could be the influence of the Kyuubi, it could be a normal occurrence for an Uzumaki, perhaps he is a prodigy. Either way, we will know something soon enough. The thought, I hope, ran through his mind just as Hinata came running in, a big smile on her face as she stopped in front of her father and bowed to him. Daddy, mother said I should tell you something, but I forget. Her smile turned to a frown as she looked at him through lowered lashes, hoping she would not be punished. Hiashi pulled his daughter to him and hugged her with a huge smile. Silly little one. Just do as I have taught you. Remember where you were and what you were doing when your mother told you to come find me. Hinata's face broke into a smile which made the room light up, and Hisashi and Hiashi exchanged a pleasant grin before she spoke up. I was making cookies in the kitchen with Mama when a servant said that a man at the gate wanted you. Hiashi exchanged a hopeful glance with Hisashi, then smiled down at Hinata. Well, I am sorry this disturbed your cookie-making, little one. With a kiss to her forehead, he patted her on her backside and shooed her back towards the main part of the house. Continue your important work. I will sample the finished product later. Hinata giggled sweetly with a blush and ran off with a cry of, "Oh daddy. I know you will like them." Hiashi couldn't help but smile after her, then chuckled before he readjusted his robes and with his brother at his side walked out towards the front gate. Oh. Flashback. Naruto whined in pain as he felt himself bounce along ever so slightly, his middle squeezed but not harshly, almost gently, as the sensation of being carried brought him back from the world of darkness that had claimed him. His chest still burned and he could feel the drip of warm liquid as it ran down his shoulder and arm to fall to the ground. He blinked his eyes open and whined again as the sensation of being carried awkwardly lessened. He had had enough and wanted to sit. Mama. Down. He felt himself gently lowered to the ground and he got his legs under him and tried to touch the pain in his chest, but as his fingers made contact he cried out and whimpered. Mama. Hurt. He said as he pointed to the knife wound just before he felt the familiar sensation of a cold, wet nose, and a furry muzzle bump against him before the soothing feeling of a wet tongue licking gently at the cut until the blood stopped and the cut closed. After a few more licks the pain was gone and nothing remained but a slight crease showing where the cut occurred. Within a day even that would be gone. Naruto stood up and looked around at the unfamiliar surroundings, wondering where he was at. He stood on top of a flat-roofed building, and everywhere he looked there were more roofs going off into the distance. He walked over and looked down and realized he was a lot higher up than he would like as a wave of vertigo hit him, and he fell backwards into a familiar warm, furry feeling. Before he could react he felt the muzzle again, this time knocking him over and sniffing at him. He giggled as the sensation reached his funny bone, that all kids have, and he laughed uncontrollably until his stomach growled loudly. With a frown he held his stomach for a moment until he felt himself pulled closer to the warm furry body, and he instinctively found the spot reserved for him months ago and began to nurse in the warm bosom of his mother. Present. Naruto awoke alone and he looked and felt around but could not find his mother anywhere. After a few minutes he whined but got up and looked around more. After a few minutes he sat down again and thought about crying as loneliness began to set in. After the woman who took care of him disappeared, his mama had been there all the time except when she went to find food for herself. With a flash of realization he clapped his hands and giggled. Mama hungry too. With a satisfied nod of his head he sat and waited for her to come back. Sometimes this would take several hours, but he knew she would return for him. She always did. He got on his knees and crawled around the roof for a little while, not really knowing what else to do. He started playing with whatever he could find. After an hour had gone by he heard voices that he didn't recognize. With his recent encounter with the men that hurt him he crawled cautiously over to the sound where he saw 3 men kneeling in a semicircle conversing quietly. You think he'll show up soon? One boy asked. Another shrugged as the third picked up a rock and tossed it off the roof. The second boy punched the third in the shoulder. Hey stupid, that could hit somebody. The third boy shrugged his shoulders and frowned. So. The second boy punched him again in the same shoulder. So we are trying to hang low, remember? The third boy nodded sheepishly then chuckled. Oh yeah, sorry. The first 2 boys snorted and or shook their heads in disgust as they went back to waiting quietly. Naruto thought about going out to talk to them until his mama got back, but as he went to move a pain in the back of his head made stars bloom in front of his eyes and he collapsed to the ground unable to move, barely conscious. The 3 boys turned and looked at the newcomer, a much older boy than themselves, as he stood over Naruto. You are worthless. This dink snuck up on you and you had no idea he was here. He can't be more than 5 and you didn't even hear him. The larger boy kicked Naruto in the ribs, eliciting a groan from him, but he didn't move. The 3 boys frowned and looked down at their feet as they stood there. Well, we weren't paying attention, boss, sorry. The bigger boy frowned as he picked Naruto up and looked him over. Pack that sorry in your. If I was a watchman, you'd be as good as in a prison cell for that botched job we pulled yesterday. Now shut up. I think I got a way for us to make some of the coin we should have gotten last night. As Naruto tried to mumble for his mother, a second blow to the head took away his consciousness as he heard the larger boy laugh. Oh, oh. The boy dumped the sack out and Naruto fell to the floor in a bruised heap. Still unconscious, he didn't notice the collection of men that stood around him or the one that rubbed his hands in appreciation. Well, a good catch indeed. I will give you the standard wage for young flesh. The boy shook his head as he stopped the man from grabbing Naruto. No, double. The man did a double take as he looked the teen over, then stepped back from him. Why? The boy smiled as he pulled up Naruto's shirt and the seal glowed briefly as he touched it. Most of the men gasped, then jumped back from the boy. I figure there is something special about this one since he has a seal on him, so double. The man's face was livid as he pointed at Naruto. Get that thing out of my warehouse. How dare you bring it here? The boy blinked, unsure of what to do, but before he could speak, a heavy-set man stepped forward and dropped a bag of coins to the floor with a lascivious grin on his face. Double, plus some for bringing me this prize. The other men looked at him in confusion, but the boy happily snatched the bag of coins, then grinned as he gave a half salute and ran out of the warehouse. The portly man snapped his fingers and two men came over and placed Naruto's body back in the bag and carried it out of the warehouse. The smaller man stepped up and growled at him. Are you nuts? I wouldn't bring my tool anywhere near that kid, the QB might bite it off. The man looked over at him coldly, then smiled like a shark. Oh, there are much better uses for him than as meat on a stick. If I am correct, you will see in 6 months. He placed his hat back on, then grinned as he tipped it to the other men. Good day, gentlemen. The remainder of the men shrugged at each other as he exited the warehouse. Oh. Naruto woke slowly. The feeling of being tied down made him move his arms and legs, and he realized he was. Was he bad again? What did he do this time? Why was he always so bad? He didn't mean it. He tried to apologize, but a thick dry cloth made it impossible to get words around it. Ah, I see you are awake. Excellent. The cloth was pulled from his eyes and he blinked at the bright light until he could focus on the little man in front of him. His hair was completely gone on the center of his head. He was rail thin and short. The most obvious thing about him was his eyes. Even though he smiled, his eyes were completely dead. No humor, no sadness, not any emotion in his eyes at all. The man scared Naruto. He tried to pull his arms loose, but all he could do was make the metal that secured the straps to the table clink slightly. He whined and tried to call for his mama, but with the cloth in his mouth he could only make slight muffling sounds. The little man pulled a tray over to the rack that Naruto was tied to and he smiled at him, which made him want to squirm and run away as fast as possible. The master says I have 6 months to make you compliant. He touched Naruto's skin and smiled as he nodded. I only need 3. The man tightened the straps until Naruto cried in pain, tears flowing freely down his cheeks. The man frowned slightly, then patted him on his head as he laid out his implements of pain. It's nothing personal, Moppet. It's just what I do. I hope you don't hate me afterwards, but you probably won't feel anything at all afterwards. Naruto's eyes opened impossibly wide as he strained to get away from the sudden pain in his side and tried to call her to him over and over again, but his heart broke when after an eternity, she still hadn't come. Oh. Hiashi got to the gate and frowned deeply as he saw the guard that he had expected standing there, but also the one person he had hoped he would never lay eyes on again. Walking to the guard, he accepted the envelope and handed him a small pouch that jingled when he shook it, which he quickly pocketed and left the grounds. Hiashi opened the envelope without looking up and growled at the man. Explain to me why I should not have you killed or worse on the spot. Jeriah grinned as he stood there, leaning against the guard post, arms crossed over his chest. Well, that wouldn't be very neighborly of you now, would it? Besides, if I thought you could do it, I wouldn't have come here. I am a Sannin after all. The man was insufferable, but Hiashi decided to wait before playing his ace in the hole. Why are you here, Toad Sage? Jeriah shrugged before walking closer to Hiashi and his brother. I need your help. The boy is missing and I fear for his safety. Hiashi looked up at him and frowned. So you stole my brother's child, and now you lost him, is that what you are trying to tell me? Jeriah frowned slightly but then nodded slowly. Something like that. Yeah. Hiashi nodded as he handed the paper and envelope to Hisashi and turned to go inside, gesturing for the Toad Sage to follow him. Then we have a common goal and much to discuss. Jeriah followed Hiashi inside as Hisashi read the paper then gasped. No. How is this possible? The report showed that the three men had died immediately from their wounds, which appeared to be large claw and bite marks, but upon closer examination it showed that they had also been dismembered. From the inside out. Hiyashi's hand clenched the teacup tightly as he lowered it to the table. His face was calm, but anyone with decent observation skills could see that the muscles in his hand were taut and he could barely stop it from trembling. Hisashi stood behind his brother. A slight look of worry creased his brow as he hoped he could maintain control. You said you know of someone else searching for Naruto. Jeriah grinned before picking up the cup in front of him and sipping at it. With a sound of appreciation he put the cup down and nodded to Izumi. Good tea. She smiled and nodded silently to him and he turned and looked at Hiashi again. Through my network, I have ascertained that someone is very interested in Naruto. Interested to the point of spending thousands of yen and an untold amount of manpower in the search for him. Hiashi visibly calming nodded as he released the teacup. Is it possible you will unburden yourself of this information? Jeriah nodded slowly. Of course, I have no problem giving you this information as you seem to have a desire to find him as well. But, there is a price. Hiashi held up his hand and Hisashi leaned backward again. He had lurched forward and was about to launch himself at the impertinent Sannin. A boy's life could be in danger and he wanted compensation. Hiyashi's eyes never left Jeriah's but his lips had pressed together in a thin hard line. What price? Jeriah grinned as he took the teacup and sipped from it again. Now the hook, he thought. Well, I would require the goodwill of the Hyuga clan, of course. I do not want enemies in Konoha. It would not be proper or efficient. Hiashi stared at him thoughtfully then nodded. I could agree to that within limits. You will not have free run of my house or the estate, but you would be welcome to come here to discuss Naruto's welfare and to see that we are raising him well. Jeriah cleared his throat and Hiashi stopped and stared at him expectantly. Well, there is also the matter of his training, and I would need to have him with me for a period of time so that he can learn his father's techniques, and I can help him if he does have the Kurodenkogen. Hiyashi's lips quirked slightly in the corners as his head nodding slightly before he pressed both palms to the tabletop. How long? Jeriah's smile faltered slightly and he brought his teacup up to his lips and mumbled something incoherent. Hiashi shook his head but his smile widened. I'm sorry, did you say 15 tears, or 15 years? Jeriah spoke up clearly this time as he put the cup down. 15 years. Hisashi almost laughed out loud but held his mirth in the face of the sheer audacity of the Toad Sage. 15 years. Because of his pig-headedness, Naruto has been missing and not had proper care or training for Kami knows how long. Looking at the profile of his brother, Hisashi knew that a volcano was about to blow. He could see the throb of a vein in the side of his head and knew it would not be long. Let me see if I understand. You want me to give you access to the Hyuga compound, and you would take my adopted son away from me for a period of 15 years. Jeriah seemed to consider his words then nodded. Yeah, that about sums it up. Hiashi nodded as he finished his cup of tea and carefully set the cup back on the table. His eyes came up slowly and looked at the Sannin again. I think not. I will agree to a period of 1 year so you may teach him his father's techniques, but not 15. Jeriah shook his head in disbelief but leaned forward. 13 years. 1 year isn't nearly long enough for him to master the Flying Thunder God, or the Rasengan, let alone the Kurodenkogen if he has it. 13 years. Hiashi shook his head but cracked his knuckles and popped his neck as he began to warm up in earnest. Ridiculous. He can train these techniques here in his home and still learn everything else he needs to know for his future without having to go live in the wilds with an old hermit. 1 year. Jeriah frowned as he huffed at the clan leader in front of him. Oh come on Hiashi. At least with me he can learn all the importance about surviving in the wild, and how to live off the land if he needs to. Or do you really think table etiquette and hobnobbing with nobles will keep him alive if he is lost and alone? 10 years. Hiashi scoffed as he waved his right hand in Jeriah's direction. Yak dung. As Izumi gasped and blushed, Hiashi nodded to her in apology but continued his assault on Jeriah. He will need all we can teach him, including things that you find useless or of no meaning. Here he would have training, love and comfort. With you he would probably end up flying off a cliff with you standing there, watching him fall and hoping he saved himself. 1 year 6 months. Hiashi smirked at the look on Jeriah's face. He had seen his brother do this before. It was known within the clan that Hiashi was a shrewd man and one hell of a negotiator, and the Toad Sannin would now learn that. Jeriah frowned, but inwardly he cheered as he got a small concession from the only person he could ever remember having a hard time bargaining with. Now you're just being insulting. You know, if he's to become a ninja the way Minato would have wanted, he'll have to train hard, and constantly. There won't be any room for polite eating, or social graces that you Hyuga are noted for. He will need long hard training. I'm not one to blow my own horn, Hiashi mumbled to himself, much, but I'm one of the best people to give it to him. 8 years. Hiashi frowned as he considered Jeriah's words and nodded slightly. It is true he will need hard training, and while he can get very good training here, some of the advanced techniques like his father's would have to be learned from someone who knew him, how he trained, and what his techniques were. But he needs also to know his heritage, both past and future, and he cannot do that living in a cave with you. 2 years. Jeriah nodded as he realized he would probably not be able to get much more out of him, but he would try anyway. Well, I still think his physical training will be more important than anything he could learn in a classroom. But I am willing to give up the point for his benefit and the sake of arguing. 6 years. Hiashi also nodded as he considered but still did not like the idea of Naruto being away from them for that length of time. While I am able to agree with you on some things, I cannot agree that he would be better off with you than with us. There is much to consider, including his future as a clan member of the Hyuga estates. But, upon careful consideration, I can see where he would benefit from traveling with you for a time, 3 years, and I will choose when he can leave, and when he returns. At that declaration he realized he would not be able to finagle more time from Hiashi, but maybe. Jeriah shook his head and waggled his index finger at Hiashi. And have you dictating to me that he needs to come back to eat his soup and brush his teeth every other week? I think not. 3 years and I choose the time period. Hiashi was about to interject when Jeriah jumped before him. And we discuss the time frame before he is supposed to go with me, and a set day he will return, deal? Jeriah held out his hand and Hiashi nodded solemnly before shaking it. Agreed. This will be the best for Naruto and all involved. Especially Hinata. I know they will like each other when they finally meet, but will it be enough? He thought to himself. Hiashi picked his cup up, and his wife refreshed his tea before he even spoke, and he casually sipped at it. So what is this news you have of Naruto? Jeriah smiled conspiratorially and pulled a scroll from his shirt, handing it to Hiashi, who leaned over the table and accepted it. Opening it briefly, he scanned the contents, then he groaned before handing the scroll to the Hyuga lord. When Jeriah looked questioningly at him, he went over to a bookshelf and took down a ledger and walked over to the table and sat next to it between Hiashi and Jeriah. According to your spies, the people searching for Naruto spent almost 15,000 silver lakhs last year alone in the search to find him, bribing, offering rewards, and incentives to anyone who had a lead on his whereabouts, correct? Jeriah nodded as he watched Hiashi frown deeply, then crumble the scroll into a small ball and drop it at his side. Hey, what gives? That took a lot of time and effort to get. Hiashi slowly stood and the look of fury on his face had Jeriah mentally backpedaling. Oh no, don't tell me. Sannin. Ha. You and your informants are imbeciles. You have been researching us for the last year and our efforts to find him. Jeriah blinked, but Hiashi gave him no chance to talk. I agreed that I would give you access and you would be able to train Naruto, and I am a man of my word, but if Naruto has been injured because of your bungling, the teacup that Hiashi held shattered in his hand and the porcelain pieces carved their way into his palm and fingers in his anger before he opened his hand and dropped the bloody pieces to the table and left the room. Izumi came over and cleaned up the remainder of the teacup, then followed quietly after her husband. Hiashi frowned and shook his head before standing himself. He replaced the ledger on the bookshelf, but before leaving the room left one last bit of information for the Toad Sage. I hope for your sake we find him soon. My brother's patience is almost at an end, and I fear you will be his first target for his frustrations since you caused this. Jeriah watched as the door closed and wondered if he could go live with Gamabunta for a while. After a moment he shrugged and mumbled to himself. Well, I guess the old saying is true, no good deed goes unpunished. Oh. 3 months later. The fat man smiled as he waddled into the room, surrounded by his two best bodyguards. The warehouse seemed no different than the last time he was here. If anything, it was a little dingier and smelled a little worse, but today he smelled something more. He smelled vindication. Gentlemen, so good to see you all again. I see none of you are the worse for wear. The one man who seemed to be the owner of this little pervert club frowned. All right, Darrow, you called us here for a reason. Spit it out and be done with it. The fat man named Darrow nodded and snapped his fingers. The evil little man with the balding head came in wheeling a covered cage. After stopping it, he pulled the cloth away and a small boy in brown leather pants, and no shirt crouched there. He also wore a brown leather mask which covered most of his face and head. He blinked at the light until his eyes adjusted, then bowed his head and presented his hand to the balding man. Good boy. Good boy. No pain. Good boy. The balding man smiled at him, reaching into the cage and patting his head. Yes, you are Moppet. You are being a very good boy. Darrow looked at the assembled men, who stood in shock. A few whispers reached his ears and he just smiled at them. Is that the QB kid? Did he say good boy? I think it's just bullshit. He don't even look like him to me. Darrow snapped his fingers and the balding man unlocked the cage and pointed to Darrow. The boy bounded over, very similar to a dog or wolf, and crouched at his feet. The fat man reached down and pat his head. I assure you it is him, and he is compliant because he has no other choice, but I am willing to concede to a test. The man who had scoffed the loudest leaned closer. What kind of test? Darrow grinned, baring his teeth. Bring in one of your pitsters, and I will send him against yours and we will know for sure. The man threw back his head and laughed. This clown wouldn't last 5 seconds against my pit fighters. Darrow nodded, then looked down at the boy, then shrugged. Yes, you are right, that wouldn't be much of a contest. Bring in 2 of your fighters. The man blinked in shock but then laughed again, even harder this time. You're serious? Him versus 2 of my pitsters? What's in it for me? Darrow nodded as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a bag. Very well. 100 silver lakhs if he cannot beat them. The man nodded as he wiped his hands one over the other and walked over to a crate in the side of the room and opened it. Inside were 2 heavily scarred boys. They were chained to each other by the neck, and in turn to a ring in the floor. They crouched there until the man unchained the ring, then removed the chain from their necks. Slowly they walked out into the warehouse and looked around. No pit tonight, boys, but we have a special. They looked at him expectantly and he pointed to the boy. Kill him, and the best food I can buy will be yours tonight, and a girl for you to share. One boy nodded over and over again, repeating, Girl, girl. The other panted and drooled at whatever thought was in his mind, but feral eyes turned and took in the boy in leather who was much smaller than themselves, and a look of anticipation came to him. The boy looked up at Darrow, then at the bald man. Darrow nodded to him and the bald man took out a little black box that had a red and a green button on its surface, and a little control dial. At the sight of the box, Naruto immediately put his left hand above his head, palm facing the floor, and lowered pleading eyes to a spot 6 inches in front of him and uttered over and over again, Good boy, no pain. Good boy, no pain. The man nodded and snapped his fingers at Naruto and his head snapped back up to him. Listen to me, Moppet. See those boys? They want to hurt you, but you must hurt them bad, do you understand? Remember the dogs. Remember how they hurt you, what you had to do. Naruto's head slowly turned and his face changed. His eyes shadowed, then became red as he growled at the ones he faced. The 2 pit fighters seemed to take this in uncertainty, but when the heated touch of a whip stroked across both of their backs, they howled in pain and charged forward. The boy watched as they came, then seemed to change. A red shadow seemed to form over him and suddenly he was on them. He struck one boy across the belly, the one who kept repeating, Girl, even as his fist connected with the side of his head, but instead of going down he took the momentum from the blow and flew back towards the other boy and landed on his chest, driving him to the ground. The first boy took 2 steps, then screamed in pain as his stomach opened and his intestines and other viscera poured out onto the floor, where he thrashed helplessly, trying in vain to hold the contents of his boy in with his hands. The other boy fared a little better as he was able to land a few punches over and over again, but what he didn't realize was that the boy was not trying to fight him in the same manner. The masked boy's hands maneuvered him further up the larger boy's body, then suddenly snatched his head upward, exposing his throat for a moment before he dove in, and the sound of teeth meeting flesh and tearing cartilage could be heard, and the boy's gurgling cry as his limbs grew weaker and weaker until he moved no more. The boy threw his bloody face back and howled, fangs and claws bared and seemed to be growing as he crouched there. The room was quiet as the men stood in horror, watching the change with rapt attention, not knowing what to do until the owner of the warehouse spoke. "He killed them. He killed you too, best Rory." Rory just stood in shock as he watched the boy slowly turn his head in his direction. Darrow remembered the last time the child got that look and snapped his fingers. The bald man pointed the box at the boy and pressed the green button, and the sound of electricity arcing made the boy scream in pain and fall to the floor in convulsions. Darrow waved a hand and the bald man pressed the red button on the box and the current stopped, leaving the boy whimpering on the floor. Darrow walked within 10 feet of the first boy, who was no longer breathing, and waved his hand before looking at Rory. "Do you see? With the right incentive and training, I have the best way for me to make money." Pointing at the boy's unmoving form, he smiled. "Think of it, gentlemen, I can with him to almost anything and make a mint in the process. All you saw was the QB when he was first brought to us. Well, I see a powerful weapon, and as he gets older and stronger, I can have him do more and more. Think of it, kidnappings, assassinations, hell, I could even use him to thwart ninja missions and have the opposition pay me for it." Rory was still shocked at how easily his two best were decimated right before his eyes and shook his head. "You're a fool, Darrow. Eventually he'll slip your control, and then I'll be hearing about you being found gutted in your own house." Darrow merely laughed. "A fool am I, whose prizes lie in their own blood right now. Yours are mine." The bald man stepped forward. "As long as he wears that mask, he cannot disobey. It is a device of my own design." He walked over and ran a finger over the boy's masked head and chuckled. "All I have to do is press this button and 50,000 volts of electricity are transferred straight to him, smoking him instantly." Roughly turning his head around, he pointed to a small block lock protrusion on the back of the mask. "And no one but me and Darrow know the safe way to remove the mask without it shocking the shit out of him. But since I do not plan on removing the mask, no worry of disobedience." The boy began to stir and the bald man stood straight again as he lifted his head up. "Bad. Punish." The bald man nodded as he reached down and patted Naruto's head despite him flinching slightly. "Only a little moppet, but you are good again, aren't you?" The boy nodded as he got his hands and feet under him and crouched next to him, licking the blood from himself, all the while in between licks mumbling, "Good boy, good boy." Darrow, seeming quite pleased with himself, smiled and nodded to the cages at the side of the warehouse. "What have we there? I believe I will reward him for his efforts." The bald man leaned closer and whispered to him, but Darrow waved him off. "He is mine and I will do as I wish." The bald man shrugged and stepped back, not saying anything further. Darrow walked over to the cages, looking inside and smiling. He picked a little boy no older than 10, then chose a brown-haired girl who also looked no older than 10. He gestured to the children and his men came over and collected them, placing them inside of gunny sacks, tied hand and foot, and also gagged. After a few indecisive moments, he snapped his fingers and pointed to the floor at his right side, and immediately the boy ran over and crouched there, smiling happily as the man pat his head. Which one in this cage do you find pretty?" The boy looked at the cage and saw the children who remained and his head slightly. He looked them over, then leaned forward and sniffed at one who still wore clothes and smelled of something he remembered long ago. He felt a lurch in his stomach and nodded to her. "Pretty." Darrow smiled and nodded to the warehouse owner. "He likes this one. It seems he has good taste." The warehouse owner nodded as her unconscious form was pulled from the cage and deposited in a burlap sack. "We just got her a few hours ago, but you need to get rid of her fast. She is hot goods." Darrow looked at him and frowned. "What do you mean? You know where she is from?" The warehouse owner nodded as he took the money Darrow offered. "Yeah, and I would have shipped her out of the city as fast as possible. She wears the crest of the Hyuga clan." Oh. Hiashi sat with his brother and Jeriah. They were quietly talking of the plans they needed to make and how they would proceed. Thus far, Naruto's whereabouts were still a mystery. They were beginning to get serious reports of sightings of him roughly 3 months ago before he seemed to disappear again, so they at least had hope he was still in the city. The conversation seemed to be going rather well as the three men talked quietly, and Hiashi began to see Jeriah had ideas that none of them had considered seriously in the beginning, but now it seemed all other options had been completely exhausted. The previous efforts amounted to a lot of wasted manpower and money which Hiashi was able to brush off the council before, but some of the council's members were getting antsy, and wanted to know what the project was that Hiashi was spending his time on. They needed results and they needed them soon. The door flew open and a panicked Izumi fell into the room, tears streaming down her face. All three men jumped to their feet and rushed to her as she practically screamed over and over again. She's gone. She's gone. Hiashi felt his stomach slam into his feet and a look of fear crept into his features as he asked. Who is gone? Praying silently to Kami that he was wrong. Izumi panted, then rushed out the words that would horrify all of them in the room. Hinata is gone. Her maid cannot find her, she isn't in her room, and no one has seen her for hours, she's gone. Hinata felt a little lightheaded as she tried to open her eyes. Everything seemed to be spinning inside her head, and as she blinked her head ached more. She whimpered slightly at the vertigo feeling because she didn't understand it, but she tried not to move again until it began to pass. Using her hand she felt the floor and realized she was on a stone floor. Was she still outside? It didn't feel like the path in the garden. Her mouth frowned as she tried to clear the fog in her mind and still couldn't penetrate it completely. After a few minutes she tried to open her eyes again to see where she was. The vertigo was still there, but it was lessening enough for her to turn her head to the right and she could barely make out in the dark that she was near a stone wall. She reached up and touched it and it confirmed for her that she was not anywhere in the garden she would recognize, and her mind began to run rampant as fear began to settle in. Slowly she rolled over onto her other side and looked around but could not make out anything further than a few feet away. She whimpered again, but scooted backwards until her back was pressed against the wall. Panic was on the edges of her mind. She wanted to scream out for help, but her father's words made her stop and think. Flashback. Hiashi stood watching his daughter as she practiced Akata in the private training room of the house dojo. She was doing quite well for a 3-year-old, and he had no doubt despite the challenges of learning the gentle fist, she would be a pioneer. When she stumbled she blinked and turned fearful eyes to her father, then quickly went back to the exercise. Hiashi waited until she did it again, before he decided to do something about it. Hinata, come here my daughter. Hinata blinked then nodded. His tone of voice told her it was nothing bad, but it was serious. Stepping to the edge of the platform she bowed herself out before standing in front of him with her head lowered. Yes father. He smiled down at her then rubbed her head softly. Hina-chan, you must always remember of all the enemies that you may face when you get older, these two are your greatest. He sat down and crossed his legs in front of her so she did also and looked at him expectantly. Fear and panic. They go hand in hand. If you have fear, then eventually you will have panic unless you stop the one early. She blinked at him but nodded slightly so he smiled at her warmly before continuing. If you stop, or control your fear, then you will not panic. Once you panic however, you have lost. Panic will cause you to make costly mistakes, forget what needs to be done, even how to do it. Always, keep your head level and your kai focused, and you will be able to solve any problem. Hinata smiled then hugged him with a quiet, thank you daddy, before disengaging from him and running back to the platform to continue her practice. Hiashi grinned as he watched her, she would make a fine kunoichi someday. Recall. She slowed her breathing, until her heart stopped pounding and the butterflies stopped dancing in her stomach and she found she was able to sit up without her head hurting too much. She pressed her back against the wall and she realized she was only wearing her t-shirt and panties, and she started to panic again. Mother would be very cross with me for being in my underwear. Where are my clothes? What has happened to me? Where am I? Hinata remembered the time she came bolting from her room in her night clothes and her mother had severely scolded her. She said it was unladylike and not proper to run around if she was not dressed. Hinata had taken the scolding to heart and never again left her room unless she was fully dressed for the day. As she thought these things she had a sudden flash of insight as she realized she was not in her home or anywhere near it, because her mother would not let her be in this state of undress, let alone in a dark cold room. Slowly her memories started to clear, and she began to remember what had happened. Flashback 2. She was in the compound, somewhere near the south wall closest to the city's busiest areas. Her maid had left to go to the bathroom to take care of feminine needs. Or so she said to Hinata with a smile. Hinata shrugged and continued to watch the butterflies flitting about and sniffed at the pretty flowers. She probably had to poop. Hinata thought, then giggled. Well, it was okay. She had been in the garden by herself before. She liked this area because the flowers seemed to grow so much better here. Her father had told her it was because of the different soil. The plants were able to draw more nutrients and minerals than in other areas. Her father and mother often talked about moving some of the soil to the private garden and replanting, but Hinata had begged them not to. Her reasoning was that the plants in the private garden had grown accustomed to the soil they were in, and if they moved the soil from here, these plants might not do so well anymore. His mother and father smiled at her and said they would look for another way to improve the private garden, much to her happiness. A light stomp made her jump slight and look behind her. A strange boy stood in the section of bluebells that the hummingbirds liked so much, but worse still, he had trampled a few of them. Hey, don't stand there. You are hurting my flowers. The boy looked around himself, then smiled with a slight bow. I'm sorry, I hadn't known there were flowers on this side of the wall. Hinata watched him warily, then nodded. She didn't know who this was. He wasn't a hyuga, and he was not very clean. She could smell something sour about him, but she couldn't tell what it was. Well, I will fix them. You shouldn't be here. If the guards catch you, they will beat you and call the watchman. You should go now. She did not want to yell at him because he might get cross and yell back. He was much older and bigger than she was, but she was still a little cross herself because of her flowers. The boy looked her over, his eyes moving up and down her body, and since Hinata had never had any experience with men and the way they view women, she didn't realize he was sizing her up. I'm sorry again, little miss. I'll tell you what, I'll help you fix them, and then I will leave. It is the least I can do for hurting your flowers. She didn't understand sarcasm, so when the boy spoke the way he did, she clapped her hands and thanked him. Hinata got on her knees and started moving the soil and resituating the flowers so they would stand straight again, when an arm went around her chest and a smelly cloth was placed against her mouth and nose. At first she was surprised and reflexively took a deep breath to scream, and that was her undoing as her eyelids got heavy and she felt the strength leave her limbs. As her consciousness left her, she felt his hands squeezed her bottom and he laughed. A good price for this one. Recall. Hinata reached back and rubbed her bottom. She couldn't understand why he did that, but she also didn't understand why he brought her here. She finally started to feel better enough that she stood and felt along the wall. After a few minutes she decided to try the Byakugan. She was not very good with it yet, she could only use the first layer and not for very long, but it would be better than standing here in the dark. She concentrated for a moment, and with a hand sign she quietly activated her blood limit. Byakugan. She looked around and everything looked gray and black and she could see that she was in a room, but also inside a cage. The cage was mounted to the wall, and had one door in front of her, with a large, heavy-looking lock securing it. She started to walk towards it, but to her left she noticed a large pile of what looked like hay. She blinked as she looked at it, then took a step closer to it. That moment is when she noticed a boy in the hay, and he seemed to be sleeping. She could tell it wasn't the boy who took her, so there was no worry about that in her mind, but she was hoping maybe he could tell her where she was and how she could get out so she could go home. At that thought a longing opened inside of her, and she almost cried, but she firmed her chin and became determined not to be afraid or act like a baby. She reached tentatively for the boy's shoulder, and lightly poked it. The boy's body rocked, but he did not get up. She did it again, a little harder, but again got the same result. Taking a deep breath she poked him and whispered, "Hey, excuse me, hey." But again with each poke there was little or no response. With a frustrated stomp of her foot and whine, she poked him very hard. "Hey." His eyes snapped open and he looked at her, and she almost jumped back with a little scream as the most piercing blue eyes she had ever seen stared at her. So surprised was she that the Byakugan deactivated, and she didn't even notice, only those beautiful eyes which seemed to hold her in place. Hinata's stomach fluttered again and something suddenly clicked inside of her, something she didn't understand, but when she looked in those eyes she felt calm, excited, and something she felt only when she was alone in the gardens. She felt at peace. Oh, Naruto looked at the girl the master brought home for him and blinked. What was he supposed to do with her? There was barely enough hay for him to sleep on. Maybe she. No. No one had washed his clothes for him since the woman who watched him had died. Well, maybe she. No. He was fed regularly in the morning and at night. Besides, there was no food for her to cook. Naruto was at a loss. He had seen girls before, and they all avoided him before he was captured, so his experience with them was a bit limited. Still, he liked the way she smelled. It reminded him of the lady who took care of him. Her house smelled like it all the time and she had been very nice to him. Maybe this one would be nice to him too. He sat up and faced her, causing her to shrink back a little but then move closer when he did not make any threatening moves. He usually did not speak unless to get his point across, which the men who controlled him preferred, but for some reason he wanted to talk to her, but did not know what to say. As luck would have it, she did not have this problem. Hi, my name is Hinata. What is your name? Naruto looked at her sideways, then slowly repeated her name. Hinata. Hinata blinked then shook her head. No, my name is Hinata. She thought for a moment then touched her chest. Hinata. Reaching out she touched his chest. Naruto flinched slightly, but when her fingertips made contact with his skin, he felt a tingle all the way to his toes, something he had never experienced before, and decided he liked it. With a little trepidation he touched his chest next to her hand. Moppet. It must be his name now, the bald man called him that all of the time. The woman who was raising him used to call him Naruto, but maybe it was just something that she called him, he really was not sure at this point. Hinata blinked at the strange name but nodded and gave him a friendly smile. Moppet. Do you know where we are? Naruto looked around then shrugged. Moppet. Home. Hinata took this in as he looked at her expectantly. She wasn't sure what to talk about next. There were so many questions, and she had nowhere to start, until she felt a need and she squeezed her legs together. Moppet. Where is the bathroom? I have to tinkle. Naruto looked at her and frowned. What was this tinkle she spoke of? Was it a game? He had not played games in a very long time, but she said bathroom. He shrugged as he thought she wanted to use the bathroom, then they would play this tinkle game. He pointed to the corner of the cage and there was a covered pot in there. Hinata slowly crawled over to the pot, and when she lifted the lid, the smell made her wrinkle her nose. It had not been changed yet and the smell was quite strong. Ew. Naruto grinned then mimicked her. Ew. Hinata had an actual bathroom in her room on the estate grounds, but she had used chamber pots before. She turned and was about to pull down her panties when she noticed he was still watching her. She stopped and he blinked at her and she blinked at him. You're not supposed to watch. Naruto frowned as he thought about that. Why? Hinata frowned and resorted to an age-old adage. Because my mom said boys are not supposed to watch girls do this. Naruto blinked again. Why? Hinata opened her mouth then closed it, thought for a few seconds then answered him. Because my mom says so. Naruto thought for a second, not sure if that made sense or not. Why? Hinata thought about this again and tried to think what else her mother had said on this subject, but could only think of the last thing she had told her. Because it isn't right. At this tender age, Hinata had not yet been educated in, or why these activities were of a private matter. Indeed, her mother had only told her it was not proper, boys and girls are different, and because she said so, which usually was the end of the conversation unless she wanted her bottom paddled and sent to bed with no supper. So when Naruto yet again asked, why? Hinata very well could not tell him he would get his bottom paddled, unless her mother did it at a later date. They were the same size, but she was not an adult, and couldn't do such a thing to him. After a few more minutes Hinata started to sniffle because she did not know what to say or what to do. This distressed Naruto to no end and he came over to her. Why cry? Hurt. Hinata shook her head negatively, but tried through her sniffles to explain. My mother said, I shouldn't let a boy see me do this. It isn't right. Sniff sniff. Naruto, not understanding but not wanting her to cry, did not know what to do or say. On one hand, he was told the same thing by the lady who took care of him when he was younger, but no one seemed to care if he was going to the bathroom now when he had to go. Should he turn away? Should he watch? Surprisingly, he took her hand and held it and she wiped her eyes with the other hand. For some reason she felt much better when he did that, and most of her unease of the situation evaporated, and she waited to see what he would do. He smiled at her, then with his other hand he pointed himself at the pot, and peed into it until he could go no more. Hinata blinked and realized for the first time, he was. She had been so intent on his eyes she had not looked at the rest of him. She felt a surge of emotion she could not identify. She had never felt this before, but it made her face feel slightly warm. He just smiled at her, then pointed to the pot. You go. It okay. Hinata looked at the pot, then looked at him again, then nodded as she pulled her panties down and did her business. After she was done, she realized there was no paper or water to clean herself. She looked around, but could find nothing. When she felt the urge to cry again, Naruto reached out and took off her t-shirt. She was on the verge of stopping him, but his hands were insistent, so she relented. He then tore the shirt into strips and handed them back to her. With a huge smile she accepted them and used one to clean herself, then recovered the pot. Naruto walked over to the hay and slivered into it like a snake and sighed. Hinata watched him with wonder, then realized she was cold. She hugged herself as best she could, but she did not feel any warmer. She once again felt the urge to cry. She was in a strange place, with a strange boy, and she missed her home and her parents. She tried not to make any noise, but the boy must have heard her. Sitting up he blinked at her, then with a sigh he begrudgingly patted the hay next to him. Hinata frowned at first, but the choice between freezing and sharing a makeshift bed with this stranger was a relatively easy one, as the voice of her mother telling her it wasn't proper slowly got softer and softer until she couldn't hear it anymore. She settled into the hay next to him, trying to get as close as possible to share his body heat without actually touching him. Naruto noticed her shivering, then remembered how he used to be held by the woman who took care of him, so he reached over and pulled her close to him, her back against his chest. Hinata stiffened. She had only ever been hugged by her father and her uncle or cousin Neji, but never by any other boy, again because it didn't seem proper. But his arms seemed gentle, and it did make her feel warmer, and there was something about this that made her fear slip away, made her mother's admonishments go silent, ultimately made her feel comfortable. She moved closer to him and felt the way she did when her father used to hold her like this. At this point, she could not see what was so wrong about it. Maybe her mother was wrong about other things too. She did a slight double take as she thought about it. Could a mother be wrong? They seemed to know everything. But why would her mother tell her things like that if they were wrong? Obviously she was wrong about using the bathroom, and there was nothing wrong with them sleeping together like this. In fact, it felt right. With a slight nod of her head, Hinata reached down and pushed her panties to her feet, then kicked them off, before settling back against him again. The new contact felt more comfortable than before, and she found it did not hurt or shame her the way her mother would describe. Naruto felt her bare skin against his and he was surprised. He actually felt comfortable, and did not mind her sleeping here like this with him. In fact, before he dropped off to sleep again, he put more of the hay on top of her than he had on himself. She sighed as actual sleep began to take her, and she felt warm and secure. Hinata did not think any more about her surroundings because she wasn't alone anymore. She would talk to whoever came to feed them in the morning, then she would go home, but she also found herself hoping she could still talk to Moppet. The two quietly drifted off to sleep, not aware that things would not be the way either of them wanted it to be. Oh, Hiashi had every available man and woman scouring the city. He had gone to the guardsmen, he had questioned everyone, and he even went to the Hokage. Everyone including the Anbu had been alerted and no stone was being left unturned. The trackers had discovered Hinata had been taken from the south wall of the Hyuga estates, by an unkempt youth. He used chloroform on her, then carried her down to the industrial sector of the city. That is where they lost her trail. Hiashi was in a rage that no one had ever seen before, but at the same time he was in a panic that no one had ever seen before. He knew of slavers and the black market. The slavers were a hidden organization that kept its ugly face hidden lest they faced the executioner's axe. No one in the Leaf tolerated it because it knew no distinction between young and old. Jeriah was well versed with their tactics because he kept a close eye on the underworld and its doings for information. Knowing thus, he and Hiashi, Izumi, and Hisashi had a long conversation about what to expect. Izumi could barely keep her composure as she worried so heavily about Hinata and her safety. Hiashi only wanted to get his hands on the half-wit who would dare to lay a finger on a Hyuga, let alone his own daughter. Do what you can with your resources, Hiashi-sama. I will get mine reoriented immediately so we can find your daughter. Hiashi nodded as he hugged his wife close, trying to regain his composure. I promise, anyone who harms her will suffer like no man has ever suffered before. Hisashi lay a hand on his brother's shoulder and squeezed it before Hiashi turned and led his wife back to their room. When they had left the room, Hisashi looked at the Sannin and frowned. I do not like you for obvious reasons, and I do not care if you do not like me, but I will do anything to make sure Hinata is unharmed. I know you have some idea of what to do, and where to go, so I promise you this, I will cooperate with you fully, do everything as you say, give you whatever you want, if you will help me to get her back. Jeriah blinked in surprise but then nodded slightly. All right. It seems we have a lot to do, and no time to do it. Go change into something less regal, and meet me at the front gate. You and I will begin our search. Hisashi nodded, then turned and ran for his house. Oh. Darrow counted his money and nodded. He would have more than enough. He was a student of the old adage, with money, anything is possible. The bald man came into the room and sat in a chair in front of Darrow's desk. Without looking up from what he was doing, Darrow measured his associate. Is it taken care of? The man nodded. The bodies are in the sewage, and if they are discovered before they finish decomposing, they will still be unrecognizable. Darrow smiled. The two were delicious, but he did not have room for extra baggage. And all is prepared for my journey. The bald man cleared his throat. I still do not think this is a good idea, but all is ready. Darrow looked up from his ledger and frowned. Your opinion is noted, and again ignored. Do your part here while I am gone, and when I come back we can all enjoy the fruits of your labor. The bald man shrugged. As you wish. Darrow grinned as he finished his expense report, then placed the ledger in the desk and locked it. If he was right, and he was seldom wrong, he could retire just from the next few jobs he had planned for the kid, then he would have to decide what to do with him. Hinata was content as she lay quietly against her new friend. He snored lightly, and his nose made a little whistling sound whenever he breathed in, which of course made her giggle. But there was something about him, especially the marks on his cheeks. They looked like little whiskers. As she looked at him, she wondered if he was part cat, but that was silly. Still, if he was, she could give him catnip and warm milk, and she could listen to him purr when she scratched behind his ears. She wasn't allowed to have a cat in the house, but if he was around she wouldn't need one. She nodded quietly to herself as she thought about it, then lay her head back down next to his. She had felt much better sleeping next to him than she had sleeping in her own bed. It was strange to say the least, but she wasn't concerned anymore. She knew she was safe with him. She didn't know how she knew, or even why, she just knew. As her eyes opened and she looked at him sleeping again, she recalled one of the little talks her mother had tried to have with her. Flashback. Hinata's mother was showing her how to make and serve tea in one of the spare rooms that she had converted expressly for teaching her. Hinata knelt next to the serving set, hands resting in her lap as she waited for her mother to finish setting up, when a thought occurred to her and she really wanted to know the answer. Mama, why are we different? Her mother raised an eyebrow, but did not stop what she was doing. What do you mean, my daughter? Hinata blinked as she looked at her mother. You said boys and girls are different. How? Azumi's hand hovered over the teapot, then slowly lowered to her side. She had blushed slightly, then looked at her daughter. We are made different. Boys and girls have different parts. That is why it is not proper for little girls to use the bathroom in front of little boys, or for you to run around without the proper clothing. Hinata frowned as she thought about this, then brightened as she came to a conclusion. But you are different than me. Izumi thought about that, then smiled at her daughter. Yes, in some ways I am. But that is because I am older. When you get older, you will be similar to the way I look now. Hinata giggled and Izumi quirked an eyebrow at her again. Your source of humor, my daughter. Hinata pointed at her mother's chest, still giggling. Will I have big shirt pillows too? Izumi looked at Hinata's finger, seeing the area she was pointing at, then gave an exasperated sigh, then poked her daughter's nose lightly with her index finger. Ya Hinata, I think you have been sneaking into your uncle's library and reading his private collection. Hinata blinked at this as she rubbed her nose, but before she could answer her mother said in her usual no-nonsense tone, "Enough. We are studying tea serving, not anatomy. Boys and girls are different, and that is all you need to know for now, and that is because I say so, and as you know, mother knows best." She said this with a smile on her face, but Hinata well knew her mother's tone of voice counted how she was thinking, and right now she meant business. At those words Hinata straightened up and nodded. "Hi mama. Recall." So when she noticed Naruto peeing last night she realized her mother was right about something. Boys and girls were different, but they needed to do the same things, so they were not so different. Her thought process was interrupted by the sound of a door being unlocked which made her jump and look towards the far wall away from where she lay. The man who trained Naruto walked into the room and turned on a switch, causing a bright light to fill the room. The brightness made her blink and cover her eyes and made Naruto squirm lightly before he sat up, knocking the hay aside and he began rubbing his eyes. The man placed a tray near a small opening in the cage that looked like it was designed just for this purpose, and then walked over and picked up the chamber pot, and dumped its contents down a chute in the side of the wall. Naruto stood and walked over to the tray of food and knelt down in front of it. The man came over and ruffled Naruto's hair as he knelt there and smiled at him. "Good morning Moppet, I trust you slept well." More of a statement than a question, and Naruto made no response. He had learned early not to interrupt this man when he spoke. "And how are we feeling today?" Naruto kept his head down but raised his left hand above his head in an automatic response. "Good boy. No pain. Good boy." The man nodded as he stepped back from the cage. "Very good. You may eat now, and make sure you feed your little friend. You have a big trip ahead of you and you will need energy for what is coming ahead." Naruto didn't comment, but turned and dog walked over to the hay and dug around until he uncovered Hinata. She blinked at him as he smiled down at her and she felt a warm sensation envelope her. He turned slightly and pointed to the tray, then opened his mouth and pointed a finger to it. "Food. Eat." Hinata sat up and nodded at him. When he saw she was up, he turned and scampered back to the tray where he leaned forward and sniffed lightly at it. The man with the bald head seemed to be busy doing something at a table near the door, so Hinata took this time to squirm her way back into her panties before cautiously coming out of the hay and kneeling next to Naruto in front of the tray. Naruto looked at her then tugged lightly on the waistband of her underwear, before looking at her in confusion. Hinata had thought about coming over the way Naruto did, but while she trusted Naruto, she did not trust this man that would turn and look at them every so often. She felt a creepy feeling whenever he spoke, not like the warm sensation whenever she heard or looked at her cellmate. At first, when he opened the door she was going to ask about going home, but the man made her feel so uncomfortable, she almost urinated on herself in fear. She made sure she was close to Naruto, but refused to look at the man's face, or say anything. She looked at the tray and saw that there were pieces of cooked meat, and a bowl of what appeared to be milk. Naruto reached down and took a piece of meat and took a hearty bite, and chewed on it noisily, mouth open and slobbering every other bite. Hinata watched him, and when she realized she would not be getting any silverware, picked up a smaller piece of meat off the tray and nibbled on it more delicately. After she finished her first piece, Naruto was already starting on his fourth piece and seemed to be nowhere near ready to stop. His appetite was huge and she was amazed at how quickly he could wolf it down. As she reached for the last piece his hand made contact with hers and they both looked at the meat, then at their hands touching, and they both smiled at each other. Hinata smiled cutely, then pushed the meat to him. "You can have it. You seem hungrier than I am." But her stomach growling made him frown and touch her belly with a fingertip. "Hungry? Like me?" She blushed slightly but shook her head no. Naruto picked up the meat with a shrug, took a smaller than normal bite of it, then handed the rest to Hinata. She blinked at him but looked at the meat slice in his hand with hungry eyes. Finally, when he didn't take it back after a few seconds, she gingerly took the meat and quietly thanked him. He grinned, then sipped from the bowl of milk, every so often glancing at Hinata then looking away if she saw him. For some odd reason, he could not keep his eyes off of her. He wanted to look at her, and his slightest smile made him feel all warm and silly. He didn't know what this meant, but he liked it a lot. On the other hand, Hinata hadn't expected him to give the rest of the meat. She knew he was hungry even though he ate a lot more than she did, so when he did it made her feel even warmer inside than she did earlier. She also found herself feeling in a way she never had before, warm and happy inside, with little squirmy things in her stomach. Not that you sickos. She didn't know what this meant, but she also liked the way it felt. The man's voice broke both of their moods and caused them to look at him. Use the pot. I feel it will be a while before you can do so again. Naruto went over to the chamber pot and began to do his business, but Hinata stayed and tried to see what the man was doing. He seemed to be adjusting something on an article of clothing he held. Hinata tilted her head as she watched, but her train of thought was broken by Naruto as he poked her shoulder lightly. She turned and looked at him, a question on her face, but understood when she saw him pointing to the chamber pot. She nodded, then walked over to it, but she stopped when she saw the bald man looking at her. But he wasn't just looking at her, it was like he was analyzing, studying her. As she realized he was looking at her, she became aware of a feeling that she had never experienced before. It made her shiver and feel really awkward. Maybe this is what her mother had meant, maybe it was wrong for people to see you go potty. Naruto's face broke her vision to the old man and he grinned at her, which brought a deep feeling of relief to her. But when he went to move away, and the man had a full view of her again, the feeling returned and it made her whimper, as her hands clenched the waistband of her panties and she froze in a half-squatting position. Naruto looked where she was staring and realized she seemed upset that the bald man was looking at her. The man always looked at him, and it didn't make him feel strange in any way, maybe because he was used to it, so Naruto didn't understand her discomfort. Still, it seemed to make him feel strange in his chest to hear her make such noises. Like a pain, but different. He thought for a second, then stepped into the man's field of vision, blocking his line of sight to Hinata. Hinata felt as if she would collapse in relief. With a grateful smile, she quickly did her business and cleaned up just as the man came over to see what they were doing. With a surprised smile, he took note of what Naruto had done and what he was doing. Ah, so you like her, do you? That is very interesting indeed. With that said, he turned again and went over to the bench he was working at, causing Naruto and Hinata to look at each other. Naruto his head at her and grinned. Like. Hinata grinned back at him in return and blushed lightly. It was a funny feeling that she couldn't understand, but now when she looked at him, after him, protecting her the way he did, the crawly things got more active in her stomach, and her face would get hot. She didn't remember ever feeling this way before, but she knew it wasn't a bad feeling, just a different one. In fact, there was something about this feeling, even though it made her legs feel weak and like she had a fever, she liked it. Their thoughts were broken by the man snapping his fingers. Naruto jumped, then scampered over to the edge of the cell where the tray slot was, and knelt there with his hands pressed palms down to the floor. The man nodded at his instant response and came over and ruffled his hair, before sliding the obedience mask on his head. Naruto didn't move a muscle as the man molded it in place, then raised his head by tilting his chin up until he could look into his eyes. With a nod, the man turned and walked back to the bench, and Naruto sat with his teeth clenched. It became obvious he was afraid as the man turned back holding the black box in his hands and Naruto began to tremble. Do not worry, it is the usual test, Moppet. You are not being punished. Naruto nodded, still taut as a bowstring, then screamed as the current shot through him, but was cut out almost as fast as it began. Hinata screamed too as she saw the look of agony etched on his face, and ran over to help him. Thankfully, the current was already off as she reached him, and the man watched in curiosity as she touched his face, and began to cry for him. Moppet, Moppet. She shook his shoulder a few times, but he did not respond to her voice or her touch. In anger, she turned to the balding man and screamed. What did you do to him, you big meanie? Please don't hurt him anymore. To her surprise, she felt Naruto's hand touch her hand, touching his cheek, and she saw him smile at her. Okay. No pain. Just test. Good boy. No pain. Good boy. The balding man nodded but made sure to note the authentic affection she displayed for him in such a short time. Yes, it was just a test. You are a good boy right now. Hinata didn't know what to make of this, so she stayed quiet, but she felt a huge surge of relief wash through her as Naruto rose up and rested on his knees looking at her curiously. Are you okay? She asked, a slight tremor in her voice. Naruto his head to the left then nodded. Yes, I'm okay, good boy. Hinata smiled in relief and threw her arms around his neck, a few tears clouding her vision for a moment. Naruto, completely surprised by her behavior, knelt there for a moment then hesitantly hugged her back. Enjoying the sensation, but unsure of it at the same time. It had been a long time since he had had this kind of contact with anyone, but like an old rusty machine coming to life again, the old behavior, and the feelings it brought reawakened in him and he closed his eyes and held her as she cried. Oh, oh. Jeriah walked over to Hiashi, a grim look on his face. He was not in his usual Sanin outfit, nor was he dressed in any conspicuous way. He wore simple peasant attire, a straw hat, and carried a walking stick. He approached a man dressed similarly and sat in the chair across from him. My informant tells me she was taken to a warehouse in this district. There are some men that meet there on certain nights, and they barter in all kinds of things, mostly in human trade. Hiashi made a face but sipped his tea as if he were having a normal conversation with a friend. They had gotten more information just by themselves than the entirety of the Hyuga clan. It was hard for him to sit idly by, but they would not blow their cover, especially if they wanted to get Hinata back. When will these dogs meet again? Hiashi whispered around the cup. Jeriah smiled and slapped his hand on the table, as if Hiashi told a great joke. Tonight at 9 p.m. Supposedly a new shipment of exotic goods came in and they try to sell them off as fast as possible. So their timetable has pushed our hand, we have to go tonight or it might be too late. Hiashi almost surged to his feet with a cry of indignation. We can't be too late, we won't be too late. He thought fiercely to himself. We may have already lost Naruto, we cannot lose Hinata because of these despicable bastards. Jiraiya's cautioning hand seemed to rest on his knee, and his eyes practically screamed a warning for him to calm down. Slowly he began to breathe deeper, and deeper until he was calm again and smiled to Jeriah as he poured himself another cup of tea. Glancing around the tavern from under and around the edges of the sunglasses he understood. People were watching the two of them. They were in a darker part of the city, a part that the city guard seldom patrolled. If he gave them away, or if they suspected that they were there to do them no good, they would make Jeriah and himself disappear like so many others had. At the very least, the ones they were after would disappear, and Hinata would be lost. As his mind railed against the thought of losing Hinata, a teenage boy approached them and stood at the far edge of the table away from them both, just out of arm's reach. I hear you two are looking for something special, he said to them in a voice just barely over a whisper. Well, if that's the case, I can take you there, before the usual time, for a price. Jeriah, still with hand on Hiashi's knee, squeezed it warningly before grinning at the youth. Why yes we are, but how do I know you aren't going to lead us somewhere and have a gang of your buddies waiting to rob us blind? Jeriah looked at Hiashi and smiled. No offense, Tormu. Hiashi smiled also and shrugged his shoulders. None taken, Python. It has been too many years for me to be sensitive about it now. The youth raised an eyebrow and Jeriah smiled at him again. My friend has been blind for a while now, so I try not to make jokes about it to him or anyone else. Despite what he says, he is sensitive about it still. The boy looked closer then waved a hand in front of Hiashi's face. When he got no movement or even slight response, he pulled a dagger and thrust it forward, just far enough to make Hiashi flinch. He didn't, and inside Jeriah breathed a sigh of relief. The boy, satisfied with their story, shrugged and put the knife back in his belt. Cloth eyes or not, makes no difference to me as long as your money is good. Jeriah placed a silver coin on the table and slid it across to the young man, who picked it up and examined it closely. After scratching it with a fingernail, then doing the cliché bite test, he smiled and tucked it in his belt pouch. And the rest? Jeriah wagged a finger at him. Not until you get us to this place with no signs of treachery. The youth laughed then nodded. Follow me then. He turned and walked to the front of the tavern then out as Jeriah took Hiashi by the elbow and led him out the door also. People looked at them as they walked, but none stared too long. It seems curiosity for strangers was everywhere no matter where you went, but that was as far as it went, curiosity. Unlike the better parts of Konoha, no one stopped you, or asked you stupid questions about your business, or anything else unless it involved them somehow. Jeriah frowned as he thought, if all of Konoha would adopt that attitude, it might be a better place, then shook his head as he realized what his thoughts were leading up to, and he corrected himself. No, because this kind of mind your own business breeds indifference as well and helps to create the cesspool that the industrial district of the city has become, a cesspool that has been long overdue for a good cleansing. Starting with the men who work out of this warehouse, it becomes a difference between minding your own business to turning a blind eye. A blind eye will make you blind to many things you should see, and by the time you realize what is wrong, it is usually too late to stop it. I hope we aren't too late. As they walked, following the youth, Hiashi also dwelled on his own thoughts. I have no doubt we will save Hinata, we have to. I cannot let my brother go through the pain of losing a child, especially as sweet as Hinata. He is strong, but if Hinata were killed, it would break him, and I fear what he would turn into if that happened. It is bad enough he still blames himself for Naruto still being missing, but this would be the end, and I do not think anyone would be able to bring him back from it. I will find Hinata, my brother, have no doubt, I will find her or die trying. They followed the youth for a time, and occasionally Jeriah would squeeze Hiyashi's arm, directing his attention to their guide's actions. At first Hiashi saw innocence in his movements, but then he started noticing the subtle differences. The youth would tap a wall on a building, or kick a certain rock, and people in the area would leave or move to a new position. Some were following them, others were probably off to relay messages. Hiashi nodded to himself as he let himself be led by Jeriah. The thieves here are more organized than I suspected. As much as I hate to admit it, it is a good thing I teamed up with Jeriah. I would never have gotten this far on my own. The others around them that didn't follow tried to look inconspicuous and made no overt moves, but they did watch them. The hair on the back of Hiyashi's neck stood up, and he had a general feeling of the eyes on them, but he felt no immediate threat as they turned another corner, and came to a large sliding door. The boy turned and held out his hand. We're here, pay up. Jeriah looked surprised or feigned surprise. But, this is an empty alley. Where is this man who was supposed to? He let his voice trail off and the youth looked impatient, started tapping his foot. He's behind this door, but you're not gonna see him till I see the money. Jeriah thought for a moment, then nodded. Reaching into his pouch, he took out 4 more silver coins and held them out to the boy. The boy hesitated for a second, then gingerly took them. Despite his tough appearance, Jeriah could see the nervous glint in his eyes as he took the money and put it in his pouch. After the money was put away, the youth regained his confidence, then reached over and slid the door open. Inside. What you do from here is on you. Jeriah nodded and led Hiashi through the doorway, but stopped when they heard the door slam shut. A man short in stature sat in front of a table, looking over some papers and making notes on them. Well, I don't have all day. Jeriah nodded, then led Hiashi over to the table. Hiashi felt rather than saw people, probably guards hiding in the shadows in this room. He could feel at least 4 others in various positions around him, and knew that now is not the time to take action. He would let Jeriah continue his charade until he was needed. Jeriah smiled as they stopped in front of the table, and he put the walking stick in Hiyashi's hand. Well, we are looking to purchase some goods from you. The man grunted, then laid down his pencil and looked at Jeriah. Look, let's be straight up here, you're looking for young flesh, right? Jeriah looked sheepish, then nodded vigorously. Yes. That is what we are looking for. The man laughed and 2 of his guards came forward into the light and shared the laugh. Well, we can supply you with what you need if you have the money to pay. Jeriah nodded and produced a silver lock and laid it on the table. The man nodded, then gestured to one of his guards, who turned and walked back to where he had been, and flipped on a light. In the corner was a cage with 7 children of various ages, the oldest no more than 12. Hiashi swallowed hard, barely controlling his anger. All of the children were bound and gagged, and some showed signs of having been beaten, as well as other things he did not want to think about. Jeriah nodded seemingly in satisfaction, then turned to look at Hiashi. The goods appear to be good, Tormu, shall we? Hiashi nodded as he activated his Byakugan and palmed to 2 heavy end-throwing stars. Let's. Jeriah swiftly reached out and poked the guard nearest him in the throat, causing him to choke, then gasp for breath, dropping his weapon. Jeriah then followed up with a right elbow strike to the same man's jaw, breaking it and sending him tumbling to the ground, where he didn't move again. Hiashi threw both of the stars with pinpoint accuracy thanks to the Byakugan, and took both guards on either side of him in the throat so they could not cry out as they fell to the floor and bled out. With a quick back flip he landed next to the salesman and grabbed him by the shoulder and forced him to his knees just as Jeriah finished his second guard off with a vicious headbutt to the forehead. With a smirk he turned then walked over to the merchant. Guards, it's so hard to find good ones these days. The man trembled in Hizashi's grasp as he watched Jeriah approach. What do you want? Don't kill me. I can pay you. Jeriah shrugged as he squatted down so he could be at eye level with him. I want information. You had a Hyuga girl in here at least a day ago. Where is she? The man still trembled but shook his head. I don't know. I've never had a Hyuga here. Jeriah shook his head but took Hizashi's place holding him down. Hiashi stood looking down on the small man then took off his sunglasses, showing his pale eyes. The man moaned in misery and started shaking his head. Jeriah very casually grabbed his head and held it still so he could see what Hiashi was doing. Hiashi reached over and gripped the edge of the table, and concentrating his chakra into that same hand, he broke the edge off by flexing his fingers. You made a mistake by taking any Hyuga for your sick ends, but you especially made a mistake by taking the Lord Hyuga's daughter, my niece. The man watched as Hiashi using just his index finger and thumb broke piece after piece off the wood until there was nothing left except a splintered pile at his feet. Oh, what I meant to say is I did not have a Hyuga here for longer than a few hours, I sold her. Hiashi looked extremely angry so Jeriah grabbed the mont's ear and began to twist. To who? The mont's face screwed up in pain and his head twisted in the direction his ear was being turned, trying to alleviate the pain. Darrow. He is a collector. He lives outside of the district, near King's Road. The man continued to narrate to them Darrow's association and even how he had the QB brat in his possession. Under the promise of pain, the man told all that he knew of Darrow, his house, and anything else he could think of. Hiashi nodded in satisfaction. Jeriah released him but Hiashi leaned forward and smiled at the little man, his voice cold, and devoid of emotion. For what you have done, in the past as well as recently, death is too good are you. His fingers struck faster than the eye could follow and poked 3 points on the front of his forehead, and somewhere to the middle of both sides. The man fell to the floor on his side, eyes wide open, and began to drool. Jeriah looked down then looked at Hiashi as he flexed his fingers. He isn't dead, but he is now locked inside of his mind. Jeriah blinked and looked at the man again. You mean he is in a coma? Hiashi shook his head. No. He is unable to move, to speak, anything. He can only see and hear what is going on around him. I can think of no other fitting prison. Jeriah nodded but gained a newfound respect for the man he was aiding. A very cold-blooded thing he did, but he also could think of nothing better than what he would have done. Will he recover? Hiashi shrugged his shoulders. It is not unheard of, maybe in a few decades. They went and released the children and soon had members of the watch swarming through the warehouse rounding anyone up that may have been involved. Hiashi and Jeriah did not stick around for the roundup however, but instead went to Darrow's house. Oh. Darrow had finished packing and was in the process of packing up the 2 other packages he was taking with him. They had fitted the girl in matching leather pants as Naruto, and a leather halter top to cover her modesty, although Darrow kept staring at her after they dressed her. Hinata was happy to be wearing clothes again, and she smiled at Naruto and whispered to him. Look, we match now. Naruto nodded and smiled at her in a kid's manner as they both knelt in the cage next to each other. Darrow and the bald man both moved a wheeled, traveling cage next to the permanent one and opened the door, but as they were about to load them in, there was a commotion outside of the room, loud enough to startle everyone. Sounds of fighting reached their ears and Darrow stalked angrily out of the room. The bald man listened intently for a few seconds then quickly walked to a corner of the room, pressed a random seeming block on the wall, then walked through a doorway that opened. Naruto watched in fascination as it seemed he walked through a solid rock wall. Naruto had never seen anything like it before, but his attention was moved again before he could further contemplate the mystery. A man's cry of pain made them both turn and look to the door, wondering what was happening until Darrow came flying in, flung by Jeriah's hand. Darrow crashed into an unconscious heap against the wall, and Jeriah's eyes widened at the 2 as Hiashi walked in behind him. As soon as Hinata saw her uncle she clasped her hands in front of her and began crying. The last 24 hours rushed back to her, and all the discomfort and pain rushed out in one cry of relief. Oja-san. She wailed as he rushed forward and wrapped his arms around her. Are you hurt? Did they hurt you? Are you all right? She bawled and clung to him, so for a time he could not get any coherent thoughts from her, but in that time, the city watch arrived and began to clean up the remainder of the mess and took Darrow into custody. The bald man, unfortunately, was nowhere to be found, but the only person to notice his disappearance was Naruto, and he was still too distracted and nervous by all the new faces around him. The Hokage was notified, and he along with Hiashi and Ayumi rushed to the guard's main office where they all were taken to be questioned. Hinata had not left Naruto's side the entire time, but she would not let either of them leave Hisashi's side. Hinata looked with anxiety at her mother until, with tears in her eyes, she ran up and scooped Hinata up and held her tight. Hiashi rushed over and hugged them both, before looking at Naruto. He looked to Jeriah, and then Hisashi questioningly, and they both nodded. Jeriah placed a hand on his shoulder and smiled. We haven't been able to check yet, but we're almost 100% positive, it's him. Naruto, not sure what to do, crouched down on all fours and tried not to draw attention to himself. He only knew one person here for sure, he didn't recognize anyone else, and he felt once again, scared, and alone. It was going to be one of those days. Hiashi looked to Jeriah, who in turn looked to Hisashi, who in turn looked back at Hiashi. None of them knew what to do. It was originally thought that Naruto would be a normal 4-year-old boy. He would run, and play, learn and adapt to his new life in the Hyuga compound. Since Hinata's kidnapping, the guards had been doubled, and no child was to be left alone for any reason. It was discovered the maid in question had gone to the restroom as she told Hinata, but had also gone and talked to one of the guards she had been flirting with in the past. The guard was chastised, and demoted. The maid, however, was discharged from the main house's work staff and reassigned to a new position where she would learn from her mistakes. Jeriah was not told where, but he knew Hisashi had a bad temper, and Hiashi was more than prepared to make someone suffer for his daughter's discomfort. The good news was Hinata. Hinata seemed to bounce back from her ordeal with little to no adverse effects, much to Hiashi and Azumi's relief. The very next day she was tending her flowers, smiling and baking in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. Naruto, however. Flashback. Azumi's scream made Hiashi drop his writing brush and bolt toward the bedrooms near his study. He had not heard Azumi scream like that in years, and he thought, his wife, usually calm and collected, sounded like she was terrified now. He came upon his wife standing with a hand over her mouth, and pointing into the open bedroom. As Hiashi gently pushed her aside and looked in on the chaos he never expected to see, he realized she wasn't terrified as much as horrified. The bed that they lay Naruto in the night before, was, for lack of a better word, destroyed. The mattress had been torn open, and all the stuffing removed, the sheets and blankets were ripped to shreds, and the whole mess was piled and mounded into, for lack of a better word, a nest. Hiashi did not know what to say, least of all what to do. To top it off, it smelled as if someone had defecated somewhere in the room, and Hiashi was afraid to think of where. Towards the middle of the mess was a small fold that Hiashi could spot a set of blue eyes staring back at him from in the middle. Watching and waiting to see what he would do. He knew that Naruto had been through a bad ordeal, he knew that Naruto was for all intents and purposes a lost soul, but how to bring him back? Hiashi thought at first to scold him, but then he remembered Naruto's reaction before they got him to the compound. Flash. Somewhere south of Sanity. Naruto was stiff and barely responsive when the doctors asked him questions. He seemed ill at ease, and kept looking to Hinata, who unfortunately was held tightly by her mother. While nervous though, Naruto seemed to take the doctors' poking and prodding well, until they tried to remove the mask. One doctor had grasped the clasps and he grew instantly violent. So much so that no one tried to touch the mask again. 4 house members and numerous stitches and shots would attest to that. They say the human mouth is very dirty, well those same house members will admit the teeth are very sharp too. Naruto stood in the corner that night and growled at anyone that came near him, teeth bared and eyes hardened. He seemed more like a cornered animal than a child they were trying to help. They were at a standstill until Hinata pulled her father's robes. Daddy, let me. At some point during this she pulled away from her mother, as Izumi was too shocked by Naruto's behavior until Hinata had slipped from her grasp. Hiashi blinked but then nodded to his daughter with hope in his eyes. Izumi reached out a hand, wanting to stop her, but Hiashi gave Hinata the okay, so she could not argue with her husband's decision. Izumi slowly lowered her hand until it pressed atop the other one at her hip, and stared on unhappily. Naruto crouched in the corner still growling from time to time at everyone else in the room, but when Hinata approached him he stopped growling and actually whined at her. His eyes seemed to plead with her, and she felt a strong pull of emotion that made her sad. He looked scared, terrified actually, and very alone. No, she thought to herself. Naruto-kun will never be alone again. In a very adult manner Hinata cupped his cheek with her left hand and smiled at him before she hugged him. Everyone stood flabbergasted. Not a single jaw wasn't on the floor. No one could believe that this child was able to comfort and calm Naruto where everyone else had failed. It was a rather touching scene which made a few smile. Izumi, however, seemed horrified as she watched her daughter hold and provide comfort and soft feelings to him. She was torn between yelling at Hinata to get away from him, and going over and snatching her away from him, but she knew she could not contradict her husband in front of others, especially other house members. That would be highly disrespectful and it would cause them both to lose face in the eyes of their own household. Izumi continued to watch, wringing her hands painfully as Hinata whispered to Naruto and stroked his face. After a few minutes Hinata looked at her father and smiled. "It's okay, Daddy, he is just confused and scared. It was how I felt when I woke up in the other place with him. Moppet just needs to get used to it first." Hiashi walked a few careful steps closer to them, but stopped when Naruto looked at him and growled. Hinata shushed him and told him it was okay, but he still watched Hiashi warily until he laid a gentle hand on Hinata's head and rubbed it affectionately. "Thank you, my daughter. It should not surprise me that he has affection to you." Naruto blinked as he watched the reaction of Hinata, who smiled cutely, and he remembered the man who trained him. Naruto blinked then pulled away from Hinata, just enough so he could look in her face. With a shaky finger he pointed to Hiashi. "Who?" Hinata looked up at her father and smiled. "That is my Otusan, my father. I call him Daddy," she said cutely, which caused Naruto to look up at the other man. Hinata seemed to approve of the man in front of him. It was no wonder Naruto was confused at first. There were so many strange faces and stranger emotions swirling around him, and Naruto didn't like any of it. He wanted to run, he wanted to hide, he wanted to call for someone, he couldn't remember who, but he was sure there was someone he was missing. But what made him almost lose it was when the first man tried to remove the mask. Only the bald man would do that, and Naruto remembered the first time he tried to take the mask off himself. It was like the man punishing him without being there. After that happened, Naruto had lost some of the feeling in his fingers and toes. It is assumed that he had suffered some nerve damage, but since he did not tell anyone what had happened, no one bothered to check to see if he was alright or not, and the feeling did return to him after a time. So after that, naturally, Naruto waited until the bald man removed the mask and didn't let anyone else touch it again, including him. Naruto was wary as he looked at Hiyashi's smiling face, but here was his new friend Hinata, and she seemed to trust this man she called Daddy. After a few seconds Naruto nodded. If she trusted him, then that was a good enough endorsement for him. Naruto, already on all fours, lowered his eyes to the floor and raised his left hand above his head, palm facing the floor. "Good boy. No pain, Daddy, good boy." This gesture was not lost on Hiashi, and it broke his heart and angered him at the same time. He had seen this done countless times, to horses, dogs, even larger less domesticated animals, and of course slavers did it to humans, but he had not expected to find his adopted son like this. Someone had broken Naruto's spirit, tore him down and rebuilt him into this. Hiashi swore if he ever got his hands on the men responsible. But that was a lesser concern right now. Forcing the biggest and friendliest smile he ever wore, Hiashi looked at Naruto but gently spoke to Hinata. "Can you help him take off his mask? We want to examine him and make sure he does not have any injuries." Hinata nodded and looked around Naruto's head until she found some complicated-looking clasps near the base of his skull. When she reached for it, Naruto dropped to the floor and began to mumble over and over again, "Good boy, no pain, good boy." Every time Hinata tried to grasp the clasp he would move his head away from her, but he made no move to attack her. Hiashi found his behavior to be strange to say the least, but when Hinata finally grasped the back of his mask, Naruto became frantic and began to babble incoherently and whine. He seemed torn between wanting to stop her, but not wanting to make her unhappy. Before she could manipulate it, Hiashi reached over and stopped his daughter, then waited for Naruto to calm before asking him a few questions. Why don't you want to take the mask off, Naruto? The boy looked up at the man called Daddy, then frowned. Didn't he know about the mask? Didn't he know the pain it caused him? And why did he call him Naruto? Didn't he know that was his old name? Naruto blinked in confusion, but tried to answer the best he could with his limited knowledge. Pain, hurt, bad boy, hurt. Good boy, no pain, no hurt. And for emphasis, Naruto pointed to the mask as his eyes pleaded with Hiashi. Jeriah leaned forward, but kept his distance, not wanting to rile Naruto up again. In my travels I have heard of similar devices, but the ones I was made familiar with were collars, and they are used to stop dogs from barking too much. When they bark, it gives them a mild shock. This is the first I have heard of or seen a mask used in this manner. Hiashi frowned as he looked at the toad sage. So they treated my son like an animal. Like he was a dog. Jeriah shrugged. There wasn't much else he could say. He knew Hiashi's reaction would not be favorable, but he couldn't give him a definitive answer because he wasn't there. Hiashi reached out and lightly pat Naruto's head, which seemed to calm him. In his gentlest voice he reassured the boy. We will find a way to take the mask off, don't worry. Naruto wasn't worried. He started to feel comfortable again with an authority figure he could answer to. His feelings were fairly level as he looked at Hinata and immediately felt better. And this time when the doctors approached, Hiashi gave him a nod of approval, and Hinata stayed at his side, so he allowed them to examine him. The rest of the night they made sure he was healthy. He was a bit malnourished, but the physician assured Hiashi that that would be easy to correct in a few days with proper food and vitamins. While they checked Naruto, Hinata looked at her father. Daddy, you said he was your son. Does that mean he is my brother? Hiashi nodded down at his daughter, then lifted her up onto his lap. Yes, my daughter. I have adopted him. He is the son of a very good friend of mine, who died just before you were born. I promised to take care of him, and it is a promise I will keep. Hinata nodded as she thought about that, then she brightened and smiled a huge smile to her father. Does that mean he will live with us? Hiashi chuckled lightly then nodded. Yes, my daughter. Naruto will live with us from now on. This brought great joy to Hinata as she buried her head against Hiashi's shoulder. He could feel the happiness coming off of her in waves, and it made him feel a lot better than he had felt in months. She leaned back and looked at her father again. But, why do you call him Naruto? He told me his name was Moppet, and that mean man called him that too. Hiashi blinked then shook his head. It may be a name they forced him to recognize. The men who held him, and who had you were not very nice men. They hurt Naruto, and tried to make him into something else, something bad. Hiashi was not sure how much she would understand, and honestly he did not want to delve too deeply into it. There were some things her little mind were not ready for, and he would spare her of such knowledge if he could. Sadly, Hinata remembered what the bald man had done to Naruto to test the device, and she realized then that there must have been other things, worse things that they had done to him. Hiashi looked down as he heard his daughter sniffle and frowned lightly. What distresses you, Hinata? Hinata looked up at her father and pointed to Naruto while she wiped her eye with her free hand. I saw them hurt him. The man with no hair made him scream without touching him. He had a box with buttons on it, and it made Naruto scream and fall on the floor. I wanted to help him, but I could not reach the man, so I could not use the gentle fist. Hiashi blinked in surprise. That his daughter would physically fight with someone to stop Naruto from being hurt both shocked him, and made him feel very proud. Kissing her forehead, he rubbed her back and bounced her on his knee a little to get her to stop crying. After a short time, Hinata's tears had stopped and he smiled down at her. With a thought, Hiashi leaned close to her ear. Tell me, little one, do you like Naruto? Hinata smiled then blushed before burying her head against his shoulder again. With a bigger smile of his own, Hiashi went back to watching the doctors fuss over Naruto, until they finally decided it was safe to take him home. At that point Jeriah absented himself from them in order to rest, but promised he would be back in the morning. Hiashi also excused himself so that he could be with his wife and son, but he would also return in the morning. That was when they finally put him in the bedroom once they got back to the Hyuga manor. He seemed worn out, as much as Hinata, who fell asleep in her father's arms on the way back to the house. Izumi saw to putting Hinata in her room, while Hiashi tucked Naruto in. Who would have suspected he wouldn't stay there? Flash forward. Hiashi crouched down and shook his head with a slight smirk. Naruto, come out of there. Naruto blinked from the interior of his nest, as he considered Hiashi and the fuming Izumi. He liked the man in front of him, mainly because he smiled at Naruto, and made him feel more comfortable. Izumi, unfortunately, made him feel like he was a step away from being paddled, or worse. With her standing there scowling at him, he knew the safest place for him was not where she was standing. Not safe. Mean woman, hurt. Hiashi blinked, then followed Naruto's eyes to his wife, who stood there with a look of cold fury on her face. Not understanding the source of her anger other than the mess Naruto had made, he sighed. Well, Izumi is a little cross because you have made quite a mess in this room. I will speak with her later and hopefully she will forgive you. Izumi composed herself under Hiyashi's scrutiny, then nodded once, curtly to him before turning and shuffling down the hall. Hiashi knew he would have a long, painful talk with his wife later in the evening, and he was fairly certain he would be the worse for it. While he loved his wife, and he was the lord of the Hyuga manor, he also knew he had to sleep with the lady of the manor, and that was usually where he made most of his concessions. Better angry outside of the bedroom than in it, he thought. When Izumi was out of earshot, Hiashi turned and smiled at Naruto again. There, she has left. Will you come out now? Naruto blinked at Hiashi, then slowly slithered out of his makeshift bed, and crouched there with a slight smile on his face. Good boy. Hiashi under normal circumstances would be angry, but he knew once Jeriah explained the living conditions they found him in, that there would be special circumstances to his upbringing now, and that would also entail a lot of understanding. Not quite, Naruto, but we will work on it. Which brings us back to the present. The men were trying to teach Naruto about living in a house, which included eating at a table. This was a monstrous undertaking, and they realized it now as they watched Naruto cram everything within reach in his mouth, half of it falling out on the table since he didn't know how to chew with his mouth closed yet. When the lady that took care of him died, there was no one to teach him things like table manners. Silverware became things that made noise when tapped on the table or plates, and the plates and glasses became percussion instruments. The men that trained Naruto did to feed Naruto in manageable portions, so he knew nothing of social graces, just shove it in and swallow. Food was good, but Naruto began to notice a hollow feeling inside of himself. He remembered feeling like that before, but he wasn't sure why. He stopped for a moment and looked at the three men watching him, but when the feeling didn't go away, he shrugged, then continued eating. As pieces of food whizzed by them, Jeriah calmly took a piece of lettuce off of his shoulder, and placed it on the plate in front of him. Well, he said, grin firmly fixed to his face. At least he knows how to share. The two other men looked at him incredulously, then burst into laughter and continued laughing until it hurt. It had been years since Hiashi laughed like that, and Hiashi laughed because he was happy to hear his brother laugh. The three men laughing made him stop and watch them. It sounded interesting. They laughed like something was incredibly funny, and it made Naruto want to laugh too. The laughter was infectious enough that even Naruto started to laugh. Haltingly at first as he tried to mimic the three men, but then out of nowhere he laughed, a high-pitched belly-shaking sound that made all three men look at him a bit startled, but then they resumed laughing again. They say laughter is the best medicine, that it helps not only the body, but the mind heal as well. If this was true, then this was indeed a good thing. Unbeknownst to the three men, Naruto had not laughed in months, and after a few minutes of him laughing, he burst into tears. The laughter hadn't stopped yet, but the emptiness inside of him didn't fill in, and it began to make him feel worse, and soon he was crying in earnest. At first, the three men thought he was crying because he had laughed so hard, but when he had fallen onto the floor and curled in on himself, they were at a loss for words. Hiashi looked confused as he stood, caught between wanting to go to him, and his own pride. The Toad Sage was at a loss for what to do, but Hiashi got up and jogged to the end of the hall. Hiashi watched him go for a second, even more confused. His brother always seemed to know what to do with children, so Hiashi wasn't sure what made him get up and leave when he needed his guidance now more than ever. Slowly Hiashi stood, then walked stiffly over to Naruto and rubbed his back a few times and made shushing sounds to try and soothe him. It always worked with Hinata when she was sad, but Hiashi didn't seem to be making any headway with Naruto as he continued to bawl. Naruto could not remember ever feeling this way. He had not cried since the last time he could remember. Unfortunately, he could not remember when that was. His chest felt almost totally empty now, and that made him sadder than he could ever remember being. He knew he needed something. He didn't know what, but he needed something to stop the pain that seemed to be eating away at him. He looked up at Hiashi, and wondered at the man who looked concerned at him. He seemed as torn as he was, like he didn't know what to do either. Naruto blinked at him, the tears still coursing down his cheeks, and he felt the sudden urge to grab a hold of him, and cling to him, but a familiar voice made him jerk his head to the entry of the dining room. Moppet. Moppet, what's wrong? Hiashi walked in behind Hinata as she dashed over and hugged him, and his arms automatically circled around her and he bawled against her, still not sure why, but strangely comforted by her presence. Hi, Hinata, hurt. She blinked down at him, trying not to cry herself as his sobs started to make her feel sad also. WH. Where does it H? Hurt mop, Naruto. Hinata was still unused to calling him Naruto, but she would try her best every time. Naruto leaned back and looked at her, then pointed to his chest. Heart hurt, not happy. Hinata nodded as she laid a hand on his chest, then touched her own. I know, Naruto-kun, it hurts me too. What Hinata hadn't spoken about, not even to her mother. She felt lonely since they got back to the compound. Her mother had come and got her up early, and put her to work on her lessons, and when Hinata tried to go see Naruto to make sure he was alright, Izumi would make excuse after excuse, like she was trying to keep Hinata and him apart. Hinata didn't understand it, but she did know that she missed him, and his beautiful eyes, and cute whisker marks. The not so surprising thing was that once Hinata hugged Naruto, they both began to feel better, and the empty feeling went away. The honorific Hinata used surprised Hiashi, but he said nothing, only smiled at his brother as the two children hugged each other and cried together. Hiashi walked over and rested a hand on his brother's shoulder and smiled. I figured since he seemed only comfortable around Hinata, getting her might be the best thing for him. Hiashi nodded slowly and smiled at his brother. I thank you for your quick thinking, brother. I was going to hug him, but I think it is possible that I would have made him more uncomfortable than I would have been. It seems there is still much I need to overcome myself in order to be the best father I can be to him. The two nodded at each other as Jeriah looked on impassively. The Toad Sage was obviously thinking something, but no one noticed as Hinata held Naruto and gently patted his head while they both cried. Inside, she felt it too, a pain that went so deep she didn't understand it, but she wanted more than anything to help erase it. At that point she made a child's vow as she cried quietly with him. She would do anything to make him happy, and in turn, that made her happy as well. Hiashi felt a tingle in his mind, something unexplainable, but not bad. Not thinking too hard about it, he chalked it up to the sentimental moment. At some point though, Izumi came to see why Hinata had not returned, and when she saw her holding Naruto, a look of pure disgust crossed her face, but seeing Hiashi and Hiashi sitting there talking quietly, she turned and left the room without comment. Not seeing her come or leave, the two men continued to talk as nothing, but the Toad Sage saw more than he wanted to, and he frowned deeply at the implications of her expression. Oh. Azumi's thoughts were a mad jumble of anger, disgust, self-pity, and distrust, all aimed at one person. She couldn't understand why her husband couldn't see him for what he was, but she also knew that she would not be able to convince him otherwise. She knew deep within her being that he was doing what he promised to do, and while that honorable thing he did was probably best for the boy, it did not sit well with her. In her opinion, Hiashi was being foolish about this promise. She knew he would not go back on his word, because he was a proud and honorable man, but she fervently wished he would. But there were many times, while she admired him for his honor, she also wanted to scream at him because of it. This was just one of those times. It would be easier if she tried to see the boy as something other than what she saw every time she looked at him. A beast, an animal, a monster. She couldn't help it really. She saw nothing wrong with the way she felt and couldn't honestly see why more people didn't feel the same. Everyone that lived through the Kyuubi's attack saw the boy the same way. Very few, if any, actually looked at the boy with less than fear or loathing. They all expected the monster to emerge one day and finish what it had started so many years ago. The only reason Hiashi didn't see Naruto as a monster was because of the promise he made to the boy's father, and the fact that he kept hoping the boy would become some kind of reincarnated version of the fourth. It had to be. Her husband could not be that blind. She didn't understand it. It made no sense to her really, but she would honor her husband's decision, if not the exact letter of it. Just because he could accept the child, didn't mean she would. The image of her daughter holding the boy almost overwhelmed her again as she shuffled into the bathroom and began to scrub her hands, trying to remove the dirt that she imagined was there from touching him. She knew even though she had not come anywhere near him, the foul essence permeated anything that was near it, and she would have to make sure Hinata had a good hot bath later with plenty of soap. In the meantime, she scrubbed until she was satisfied. Oh. Hiashi watched the two little ones for a time, then looked startled at his brother. Hiashi, unsure why he warranted such an expression, wiped one hand across his nose, then looked at it, before looking at Hiashi. Is it gone? What? Hiashi shook his head and chuckled before clapping his brother on the shoulder. No, you bumpkin, I have just had a spectacular idea, one that should help us and Naruto at the same time. With a look of bewilderment, he waited for his brother to expand on his statement. It is so obvious, I am shocked we had not thought of it yet. Hiashi was still waiting as Hiashi congratulated himself, and after a few moments of his brother nodding to himself, he finally lost his patience and poked him in the shoulder hard enough to get his attention. Ow. Brother, if you wanted to spar so badly. Hiashi almost poked him again in a spot that would have caused him to lose control of his bowels, but decided it was not prudent for him to have an accident on himself in front of Jeriah or the kids, although the kids would laugh to no end. Your idea, brother. While you may be a genius, I sadly am not. Hiashi blinked, then laughed out loud. I am sorry, my brother. I was caught in the moment. The Lord of the Hyuga took a deep breath and expelled it with a smile. Now, as I see it, we three have met with utter failure teaching Naruto anything. But, there is one person who seems to have captured his attention wholeheartedly and holds it with the barest of efforts. Hizashi's face lit up as he realized now who his brother spoke of, then nodded. How stupid of us, the perfect tutor for him was right here all along, but won't Izumi have a problem? After all, she is teaching Hinata during these times of day. Hiashi considered for a moment, then nodded solemnly. You are correct, but what I will do is have Izumi split her time teaching Hinata, and Hinata will then teach Naruto the rest of the time what she knows and has learned. On the days that Naruto is not learning with Hinata, we will teach him to control his emotions, and then lean towards training him in the martial arts. Hiashi turned and held up a finger to silence Jeriah as he was about to protest. In time, Toad Sage, in time. While I understand your desire to begin his training, it will do you no good until two things happen. 1. We get him a better concept of understanding. 2. We get the damn mask off of him. Hiashi and Jeriah both chuckled at this, but Hinata had a blush firmly under her eyes, and darkening her cheeks. Daddy, don't be a potty mouth. Naruto, who had stopped crying finally and just carefully held on to Hinata, nodded in agreement, although he had no idea why Daddy would want to eat or drink from a potty. EWWWWW. Hiashi blushed lightly, then nodded to his daughter, giving her a slight bow. Hi, my daughter. I apologize profusely. I will have your mother wash my mouth with soap later. Hinata nodded once to her father while the other men laughed. Hiashi understood their laughter all too well. If he asked his wife to do such a thing, she would. Hiashi burst into laughter himself, and the men shared the mirthful moment while the two children stared on in confusion. After a time, Hiashi called both children over to him with a gesture and a big smile. Hinata bounded over to her father, pulling Naruto along by his hand until they stood in front of him. Hinata, I have a request for you to perform some tasks for me. Now these are very important tasks, so I will need you to take them very seriously. Hinata clapped her hands and nodded. Hi, father. I will perform as you command. Hiashi nodded as Hiashi smiled at them. Naruto just looked confused. Well, my daughter, as you know, there is much that Naruto does not know, and it is difficult for us to teach him, because we do not understand the way he thinks, but you seem to have a good grasp on how he thinks and behaves, so I want you to teach Naruto the things that will be necessary for him to live here with us, and to eventually move into society. Do you understand? Hinata nodded enthusiastically. Yes, father. I get to spend more time with Naruto-kun. Hiashi laughed before he ruffled Hinata's hair. Yes, that is one way to look at it, but you will have to continue your studies with your mother as well, my daughter, and she will not go easy on you just because you are helping to train Naruto, so you will have to work twice as hard. Hinata firmed her bottom lip and nodded solemnly. I will do it, father. I know I can. I cannot fail Naruto-kun. Surprised by the amount of emotion in Hinata's voice, Hiashi only nodded. He had never seen this kind of drive in his daughter before, and he was impressed by how strongly she felt. Very good, my daughter. You may start teaching him first thing tomorrow. For now, the two of you should go play. Wait, I think you should start teaching him tonight. Naruto needs to understand what to do and what not to do in a bedroom. Jeriah chuckled, but cleared his throat as Hiashi glared at him. Hinata nodded as she took Naruto's hand. As you wish, father. I will teach him all that I know, and you will be proud. Hiashi nodded as he shooed the two young ones to the exit of the dining hall. Of that I have no doubt, my daughter. No doubt at all.